Hello, beautiful people. I am Oliver Perrin for Semiagog, joined this afternoon where I am anyway. In Europe, I believe it's well into the evening, but I am joined today by Mr. Martin Lichtmes, and we will be discussing neofolk, also referred to as apocalyptic folk, and that will doubtless overlap a bit with what has come to be called industrial, just due to the nature of how these currents, these themes developed in the realm of marginal music. So I will introduce him in just a moment, or rather allow him to introduce himself just very quickly before we get started. I want to thank all the channel supporters, the Praetorian Chads who make it possible, particularly Mr. John Ski. Names were listed at the outset, so thank you to all of the credit and none of the blame. And please check out my books. This is my sci-fi book. You can find it on Amazon. It's called Vinculum, under the name Oliver Perrin. It's a dystopian science fiction tale set in Istanbul, primarily in the year 2076. It's about a book thief who is pursued by remorseless corporate hitmen and an esoteric sect of assassins. You can check that out. There's also my collection of poems you can find on Amazon. This is Cinders from the Bloomery of Youth, and that is under the name Oliver Timken Perrin, that middle name being my German ancestors. So check that out over on Amazon. Check both those books out. Otherwise, please follow the channel, Semiagog, as well as the sister channel, A Safer Space. You can do that on BitChute. God help you. You can do it on YouTube. You can do it on Odyssey, which I very much recommend. Everyone should get over there. Follow the people who are no longer on YouTube. Like Woes. Follow the people who have alternate channels over there, like Frody. Follow me while you're over there. There's also Telegram. I hope everyone will head over there because Twitter is increasingly a mess. But I'm on Twitter as well. So I think that covers shilling at the outset. That means, I believe, that we can turn to our subject, which is this idea of apocalyptic folk, neo-folk, and all the rest. Our guest, Martin, has much more knowledge about the bands, the musicians, and the music than I do, but we were both alive for it, and I was, shall we say, a fan of it back in the day. I think for me, it was more that I was into the occult, and this music was associated with that. And so I found my way into it through my various friends who are everybody, I guess, has a few of them, the uber music nerd friends who are almost, like versions of what's his name in High Fidelity, putting together weird diagrams of each type of music and how it relates. I was never much into that, but I had friends who very much were. So I'm going to be relying on Martin to carry the heavy weight as regards the history of all of this. But I can provide some context, which I hope to do. But before we get to that, I want to welcome Martin. Welcome, sir. And give you an opportunity to tell people about you and what you do, other than, appearing on streams with me to discuss strange, esoteric types of music from the past. What are you known for? What's your deal? How can people find you or follow your work?
Well, first of all, you should be able to speak or read German, because I only do occasionally these English streams. I started doing them with my friend Millennial Woes, so I sometimes do those. But normally, I'm a writer and translator, and I work for a German new right publishing house, Verlag Antaios. So, and I have written several books myself. I also did a few translations. I was banned on Twitter with some preposterous reasons half a year ago, so you won't find me there. I'm also not on Telegram, so the only way to keep up with what I do would be to occasionally check Sezession. This is the website of my publishing house, and there you find articles by me in German. So, and that's about it, I guess.
Excellent. Well, we were just talking in the background, and it appeared that we shared this interest in different bands. I can't remember what it was. Maybe you had posted something about Current 93, or I can't remember what it was. But we got into a thing of trading links, to music in the past. And I guess the idea for doing a stream about this just sort of developed out of that. From my perspective, it seems like it would be worthwhile to look back at these bands now, because some of the people involved with them are beginning to die. Some have already died. John Balance falling off a balcony or whatever, drunk. But the type of music has now come into its own and sort of, I don't know, to some extent been frozen in time. It doesn't seem like a thing that's pushing forward strongly. It seems like a thing, and perhaps correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me like a thing that was very much a product of the late 80s, early 90s.
I mean, there was the time when I entered was in the mid 90s, and it lasted until mid or end 2000s, in Germany, at least Europe, Germany. There was a scene that was quite strong, but it was a sort of a sub genre of the Gothic scene in Germany, at least most of the time. I would say by now it is almost dead. There are a few bands still doing this kind of thing, but what's lacking, I think, is the vital scene, of people being connected to each other, playing on each other's albums, doing concerts and all that. This has almost completely disappeared by now. And talking about death, yesterday I learned about a very strange story. There was this guy in Norway, allegedly a white guy who converted to Islam. I guess he was just a crazy lunatic, and he killed a few people with bow and arrow. And one of the people he killed was Andrea Meyer Haugens, and she was from a quite well-known neofolk band from the later generation called Hagalas Rune Dance, which I loved. And she lived in Norway and in England, and it's so crazy. I mean, there's a guy who is randomly killing people with a bow and arrow for that, and one of the 5 or 6 people he kills is Andrea Haugen from Hagalas Rune Dance. It's absolutely crazy. And in an act of synchronicity, I just on that day when it happened, I was listening to the band again, which I don't do very often. So it was a kind of strange thing going on here. And as for others from that era, yeah, well, they are getting old. Some have become self-parody and so. But, what I wanted to do is start this whole conversation with a little invocation, if you allow. I have here a lyric which some might know very well. It appeared on a Current 93 album, and allegedly it was played either by a sample or by a real appearance on Death in June concerts in the 1980s, sung by Freya Eswin, the rune magician. And it was a curse put on whatever government would be in charge of England at that point. And I like it very much. So if you allow me, I will read this malediction. I will not sing it because I cannot sing. I will not torture anyone with my singing. Right?
Of course.
Okay. Now cursed be thee who would ruin our fair land, and cursed be thee that would seal up the wells, and cursed be thee that abandoned the gods' hands, and built a strange place for our people to dwell. And cursed be thy breath, and cursed be thy breathing, and cursed be thy eyes, and cursed be thy sight, and cursed be thy hands that have slackened the harvest, and closed the old ways to the joy and the light. So I love this very much, and I think I dedicate this word by word to my own government or any other government in charge at the moment in the West. Yeah, so now I have invoked the spirit here, I hope.
Yes, a malediction upon them, certainly.
Yeah, upon those who built a strange place for our people to dwell. I can refer to that line a lot, I think.
Yes,
I don't know.
It sums it up. Yes.
Yeah. So where shall we start? I mean, the thing is, I proposed talking about this because I was tired of talking about politics all the time, and I realized that you were familiar with some of those bands I liked, and I thought it would be nice for a change to talk about something different. But there is a bridge politics, so to speak, a political bridge, because the way I experienced this music and this scene did influence me a lot in a political way, which did not necessarily anyone who was involved in that influence in the way I went. But anyway, this is just my pure subjective look at all this, the way I experienced it. So everything I say here is just my own personal view. So nobody who's listening here should take all I say for granted. And I'm also not an encyclopedia on that stuff, but it's a personal thing. And we choose the title Time Tries Truth, which is referring to a Current 93 album. And in fact, well, now I'm become middle-aged as well. So I'm looking back, of course, at things in my life that influenced me. And this was something that had really a strong impression on me back when I was in my late teens and early 20s. So I came a bit late to the show. I think the first time I listened to Current 93 was in 1994. I was 18. And by the time the great glory days were already over, at least the way I see it. But I remember it was a very vivid thing in the Austrian and also German goth scene. It became like a fever, like an infection. You know, everybody wanted to share the mystique that came from there. Everybody wanted to look like Douglas Pierce, and everybody was trying to solve the mystery about what is fascist about this whole thing and what the occultism means and so. And of course, we are talking here about pre-internet days, which made it all the more exciting because you could not look up everything immediately and you could not get hold on the music as easy. So you had to know friends who had rare vinyl records or tapes or who were knowledgeable about this, and who had fanzines, who had some information and so on. This made it all the more puzzling. So today you will find all this stuff we're talking about on YouTube. I checked, I really found almost everything from the time on YouTube, all the albums, all most obscure records.
Most of them. There's
Yeah.
a particular song on, I believe it's on the Portable Altamont, and it's difficult. And that's a collection. It's got some, Coil off tracks, a couple Current 93 ones, and Drunks with Guns and some other stuff. But it's difficult to say. It's probably on some other Current 93 albums because, they repeat so many of their songs and reinterpret them. But it's a particular version that has the, it's an old poem that a guy wrote just before he committed suicide. And I think it's since disappointment and despair, the vainness of all hopes declare. Since something tossed upon this restless main, I strive against wind and waves in vain. It's a recitation of this poem that the guy actually did right before he killed himself.
Isn't it by Chatterton, Thomas Chatterton?
Yes, that sounds right. Yeah. But I went looking for that and couldn't find it.
But it must be there. It's on. I'm pretty sure it must be there. But maybe you looked up the wrong title.
Yes. Well, I was looking for the Portable Altamont, trying to find it from that. So anyway,
But anyway, I mean, there are also sites apart from YouTube that upload all kinds of obscure tapes and so. And so where should we get started? I mean, I think the whole phenomenon of what we're talking about has its center of gravity, I would say, in the mid 1980s. And it was a network of related groups and bands, and they were often quite different from each other. And nonetheless, they were friends and they collaborated on the albums, and they had several things in common, even though there were other things that were very different. And for me, the center of gravity was the collaboration between these two bands. One is Death in June, the other Current 93. One is run by Douglas Pierce, the other by David Tibet. Both, so to speak, groups exist still today. They are, in fact, solo projects of these two guys, and they have very different people working with them. And the third in my own trinity was a group called Coil. which was also related to that circle. Now, others have arranged the Trinity in a different way. So some would rather name Sol Invictus, which was the band by Tony Wakeford, or others would name a group called Nurse's Wound. And this is sort of, to speak, the official line, which has been established in a book in 2003 by a journalist called David Keenan. And this book was called England's Hidden Reverse. And it was a history of the esoteric, he had found a fancy name for it. The thing is, he has a secret history of esoteric underground. This is the way he called it. Because the thing what we are talking about here has all kinds of different names, and apocalyptic folk was one of those names. So he called it the esoteric underground, another name. And he was focusing on Carbon 93, Coil, and Nurse's Wound. And Death in June and other related groups like Fire and Ice or Boyd Rice, Non, they were sort of not really purged, but not emphasized in this book because they were the most politically incorrect of the bunch. And there was a fallout between the people, a fallout between Douglas Pearson, David Tibet, and the more controversial wing of that scene. They did not want to participate in that book. So it was their own fault. They were asked to contribute interviews, but it did not. So it started all in the 1970s. And I think the mother of all this, I would say, was Throbbing Gristle, which might be a group. I guess we should explain it also a bit.
Yes, because it was also very, very collaborative as well. And those members, Chris and Cozy, and later, the Psychic TV Genesis P. Orridge, he came out of that. So, and one of the guys from Coil, right? Wasn't it Sleazy?
So Sleazy was there, and the guy who was, I guess I would say he was the center of Throbbing Gristle, Genesis P. Orridge. He died last year. He's what people call a counterculture icon. All this kind of stuff has become more mainstreamed in the last decade, so to speak. I mean, Genesis P. Orridge was really a great freak. He in his later years, he would adopt a sort of androgynous personality, using strange pronouns.
But long before anyone else
long before the woke crowd chimed in, and he was having fake tits and all, and he was part of a strange experiment where he wanted to become one with his girlfriend, and she died and all that. Now, and he was certainly adopted by today's progressive crowd, but I think deep down he was not really part of that. His memoirs have been published after his death, and they were called Non-Binary. And I was sort of pissed about it because, of course, it was trying to get into the recent gender ideology fad, right? But and rightfully, I would say it's not wrong to put Genesis P. Orridge and that thing in that line, but it's also not entirely correct because he was about other things. Certainly, these were freaks, and Throbbing Gristle was his first group in the 1970s, and there were 4 other guys with it. Cozy Fanny Tutti was not her real name. There was Sleazy Christopherson, who later became Coil, and the third guy whose name I have now forgotten, Chris something. He formed Chris and Cozy with Cozy, and they were all about creating horrible noise, using offensive imaginary, from what concentration camps, serial killers, all things dark and terrible, things that have become a cliche later on, like references to Aleister Crowley. I mean, Crowley was, of course, already popping up in the 60s with the hippie generation, but Charles Manson and all that kind of thing. So there was this strange noise music which was infused with terrible samples, and the stage shows were also very provocative, and they were called by some British MP the wreckers of civilization, right?
And weren't they? Would it be safe to say that they are? That you could call them the first or one of the very first of the bands that got called industrial?
Yeah. I think the very term comes from them. They had a label called Industrial Music for Industrial People.
And were they
And
before Einstürzende Neubau?
they were way before them. They were way before them. I mean, in Germany you had the group called Tonsteine Scherben, which was a predecessor from Einstürzende Neubauten. But Throbbing Gristle really changed the game about what you could do in music, or so-called music, right? So there was something really dark and subversive about it. And I mean, if we talk about political context, which we have to, some people will wonder what has this got to do with right-wing things, because many of these artists we will discuss, they cannot be classified as right-wing at all, maybe on the contrary, but they also do not fit into the left-wing thing.
Can I jump in with one observation there? Because at this time, it's around, I can't remember, maybe it was like 1983 or something. I always date the end of punk rock and hardcore and all of that as a genuine youth movement. It's half a joke, but it's half serious, from the release of the 7-inch by Minor Threat, Salad Days, where he's like, wishing for the day when I first wore this suit, baby has grown older, it is no longer cute. He's like, it's, on I stay on, where do I get off, on to greener pastures. So they're basically saying the whole punk thing has been co-opted. And I'm not saying I'm a big Ian MacKaye fan or anything, but I measure the end, in the early 80s of punk and US hardcore and all of that from that time. And that was, Throbbing Gristle is sort of like before the neofolk, setting the stage for it, kind of smashing the forms and saying that you can do anything. And then out of that chaos, the other stuff comes. But I think it's important to say that the music of youth rebellion at that time was being co-opted, from the point of, where Throbbing Gristle's kind of coming onto the scene and getting well known. The previous music of rebellion was being very much absorbed and co-opted by the system. And I often talk about, teenagers and teenage rebellion. They have to do things like become increasingly rebellious as their own native forms of rebellion are co-opted by the system. And I think that's one of the reasons, for example, why you saw the reemergence of heroin with grunge and so many people shooting up and committing suicide, because all their mechanisms, all their vehicles of rebellion were being co-opted within, not literally, but almost co-opted within minutes, and then puked back out by the system as a product. And the reason I bring this up is that Throbbing Gristle kind of marked this point where the forms got shattered, but in a different way than punk. Punk had done its own things, but this one went deeper, because punk didn't have a spiritual message. Punk didn't look back at metaphysical poets or a range of history, or even.
But that came later. I think first there had to be destruction to pave the way, in a sort. Throbbing Gristle and Sex Pistols, for example, they had in common that these were people who could not play instruments, and everybody who went to their gigs thought, wow, this is cool and I can do it as well. So it was very inspiring. And Throbbing Gristle went far further than any punk rock band in this extremely aggressive, destructive, nihilistic attitude. But also, they didn't have any instruments at all. They had tape loops and noise machines. I don't know, I don't know what they used, but it was not instruments in a common sense, and
they were not musicians, as you pointed
out.
No,
they were not really musicians at all. And
are any singers worse than neofolk singers in terms of their voices? I don't think so.
Well, I think Douglas Birch has a good voice. I like his voice, but it's part of the program that you cannot sing all too well, but was the same thing in punk rock. So Throbbing Gristle was the punk rock of what came to be the industrial scenes, and it inspired a lot of people to do this the same. And this is how the other groups we are talking about emerged. So if I start, for example, Nurse with Wound, like this was a guy, Stephen Stapleton, and he came from a bit different kind of music. He was a big fan of krautrock and of European, psych and prog rock and
like
experimental
Faust
music,
and Can.
Faust, and all that kind of stuff. And he was even a roadie for these bands when he was a teenager, and he became a huge nerdy record collector. And by the age of 20, he had an immense record collection of the most wildest, obscure stuff you can have. And he wasn't so much into Throbbing Gristle and all that, but he became associated with that scene. And Nurse with Wound was a way. This was his band. Nurse with Wound was founded in 87 or 78 or 79 or so, very early on, and he was very young, and he had a few pals who were just as nerdy as him, and they created these surrealist soundscapes, so to speak. And it became more and more refined the more he moved on, and he's still doing a lot of stuff. And this music was in no way, let's say, ideological in the way other neofolk stuff would become later.
And it's even difficult at times to call it music. It was that far out.
Yes, absolutely. But there's some they put out some real crap, and they put on stuff that is real genius. But I never got really emotionally attached to them. But this is an important part. So here is Stephen Stapleton. And unlike other people of that area, he was always looking like a hippie, with long blonde hair and a long beard. And he is a hippie at heart, so to speak. And so he did not really fit into the other crowd. So, and now comes, I'd say Coil would be the next. So Coil was two guys. One was Peter Christopherson from Throbbing Gristle, and he had a career as a art designer for record covers. He worked for this famous group Hypnosis in the 1970s. They did covers for Pink Floyd and such. And later on, he also had a parallel career as a director of music videos. And he did a lot of them for mainstream bands, but also for more edgy stuff like Nine Inch Nails and so Ministry and so.
And you could see that in the Coil videos. Like, for example, his one where they covered Mark Allman's Tainted Love. At the time that video came out, that was as well produced as anything on MTV at the time. Of course, it never got played there.
Absolutely. No, Peter Christopherson, he was a real professional. And he was working comfortably he was comfortably crossing the line to mainstream pop and rock music and all that. So he had this basis. And he got to meet John Balance, who was also a very young fanboy of Throbbing Gristle, and he was editing a fanzine or so. And this is another aspect. He was gay, sleazy, and he and John Balance, they became a couple, and they stayed a couple for many years. I
should add in there that that they come out of a very specific current of homosexual rebellion that you could see beginning to appear with the Beats, with people like Ginsberg, but very specifically Burroughs and Geisen, Brian Geisen. And so with that, they had this sort of vibe where they were looking into things that had been done in the past by Geisen. So Topi was into that as well. Temple of Psychic Youth that Genesis P. Orridge put together. They would send out their plans. These are Topi plans from back in the day, from probably about 1990 when I got them. But just so you understand, I know you do, but so the viewers do, it was very much a thing where homosexuality and the occult, in the case of Coil, not with these other bands, it wasn't about being gay, but with Coil found its own strange brand niche, which was homosexual rebellion, neofolk, electronica, and the occult. And in many respects, I think some of them actually had interacted with Burroughs and Geisen. Maybe just Burroughs. So there was kind of a continuity there.
Yeah. No, they were friends with Burroughs, and they met him, and they are hard. Their style is hard to nail down because they continually tried out new things, but it's mostly electronica. And the curious thing is that the gay thing is not so much in the foreground. Christopherson, at one point, he would even say we are not a homosexual band, which is curious because everybody who was member of the band or who was in the closer circle was sort of homosexual or sexually deviant.
More than sort of.
Yeah. So it was no, well, yeah, of course. It was, let's say it was an extremely gay thing here going on, but of a particular brand, as you said, and this is also true for many other groups of that scene we are talking about. I mean, Death in June would be another case. Here the homosexuality is a bit more complicated than with Coil. So this is the one thing, and the other thing was drugs. So Coil was definitely a total drug band. There was a lot about psychedelics and exploring the unconscious, and the occult is a way to go there, and drugs are a way to go there, and the music is a way to go there. So I mean, I've never taken any drugs, but I can see that the music of Coil does put me on a trip. I get very trippy when I listen to that. So and they did really amazing things, I have to say. So this is one important thing, and it took their toll. Also, both of them are dead now. John Balance, he became an alcoholic. I mean, in the early 1990s, they were doing ecstasy a lot, and the music became also a bit techno-like. And to come down from ecstasy, he started drinking, and he became an alcoholic, and he died in 2004, falling off a balcony. And Sleazy died a few years later in his sleep in Thailand, where he was living at that point, and nothing is known about the cause of his death, but he wasn't even 60 or so, or early 60. I mean, he wasn't old, but certainly it had to do with their lifestyle, which was
I would guess, yeah. And I know of them because my thing was, as I mentioned to you before we started the stream, I was in, or I guess I mentioned it here as well, that I was into the occult side of things, and there was a magical group that appeared in Britain around this time, and I was in it, and members of Coil were in it, which is how I started corresponding with them. I actually bought an Austin Spare drawing from John Balance. I've got it hanging here in my bedroom, but it I wanted to mention that because these things are happening at the same time. At the same time, you see punk rock sort of getting rolled up and absorbed by the beast. This whole current of reaction
refused. I mean, is this the point? I would say they did not get absorbed. This is the fascinating thing. Maybe later on, no, I saw later on there was a mainstream getting more cozy, but at that time, in the 1980s, it was not absorbed by the mainstream, even though there were strange connections.
Not at all.
Coil, they were friends with Mark Almond from Soft Cell, and he had this huge hit with Tainted Love, and he would sometimes appear on Coil albums as a background singer, or even at shows, and so there was this connection to the mainstream here. But in fact, this whole stuff was really
it was the most esoteric form of music, the hardest to find about. You had to look the deepest. I wanted to mention the thing about the IoT, though, because it, as a quote unquote magical order with their thing of chaos magic, I disavow these things now, being older, but at 19 it was very, very interesting to me. What they did was they shattered sort of the old arrangement of the sort of modeled on Masonic orders with they had their own degrees, etc. But their whole idea was a form of cultural relativism, and what ultimately amounted to an idea of a sort of a nihilistic core of nothingness, and that the personality and the self and the magical practices had to be built around this core of emptiness that was entirely arbitrary. In its own way, it anticipated a number of cultural changes that came later. But I wanted to point this out because at the same time that you have punk rock being absorbed and swallowed by the monster, and this appears instead, which is much heavier, much more esoteric, much more difficult of access, much harder to find out about. You also had a parallel shift where your Golden Dawn type organizations, or your witchcraft type stuff, or your Ordo Templi Orientis, those fell by the wayside, and you had this sort of new kind of thing, like this guy Charles Brewster, who I used to correspond with in England. They'd put out these books back in the day that are talking about chaos magic and chaos theory and the butterfly effect, but somehow tying it to magic and the occult and the rest. So there was, at the same time, this is all I was trying to say, is at the same time that there was a shaking up of this other form of rebellion that had been absorbed, it was appearing also in the realm of the occult. And there's a strong parallel there because, as we can see, the Coil guys were also involved with this. Ian Reed is another one who was involved with this same magical order. And so you see, of course, Current 93 comes out of Thelema and Crowley.
Maybe we should first explain a bit more about Current 93 and also Death in June. But what I would like to talk later, and maybe you can say more about that, is about your own experience, about what are people actually looking for when they look for the occult. What is it they want to find? What is this attractive? And for maybe we also get to understand better why me as a, well, I'd say I'm a right-wing person, why I feel so much common ground with people like Coil, or even Throbbing Gristle, which on the first sight appear to be the complete opposite, of a right-wing person. And so, I mean, of course, my views have also changed a bit ever since I listened to that. But to get the story, I'd like to continue now talking about Current 93. So we had covered Nurse's Wound, then Coil, and Current 93, the third in the Trinity. So David Tibet, he grew up in Malaysia. His father was working there, and so he had a sort of colonial background. And this is a country where you have Buddhism and Islam and all kind of ethnic groups. And so he grew up in this Asian background, had also contact to Asian religions and all that. And later he became so fond of Tibet and Tibetan Buddhism that he was nicknamed Tibet. His real name is David Michael Bunting, and he got nicknamed Tibet, and he adopted this as a pen name. And so the family moved to England when he was 10 years old, David Tibet, and he also, even as a 10-year-old, he got interested in Crowley and all that kind of stuff. And so he got involved also at a very young age with Throbbing Gristle, with Genesis P-Orridge. And when Throbbing Gristle broke up and Genesis P-Orridge founded a new group with Peter Christopherson, Psychic TV, David Tibet was involved in it, and also many others who would start their own projects after that. So this was and Psychic TV was a step further from Throbbing Gristle. Throbbing Gristle would be the nihilistic force to destroy everything, and Psychic TV was an attempt to rebuild something new.
And can I plug an observation in there? You know this, of course, but Psychic TV as a part of the project that Genesis P-Orridge put together. And again, you see the appearance of like an order, right?
Yes.
And the idea of some sort of magical program. He put together this thing called the Temple of Psychic Youth. It always involved this odd spelling, where it's where you have the OV instead of and instead of the, they would have THE. So they had their own ritual forms of spelling. They put out their various documents, and these would be sent out to members who were part of the Temple of Psychic Youth. These are ones that I got back in the day.
This cross rune would be the symbol of the temple and of Psychic TV. And in the beginning, it seemed like it was supposed to be a sort of clever parody on sects or on orders or on groups like that. So there was always some sort of double edge in there. You were not sure, was Psychic TV mocking the idea of brainwashing, of coming into a cult, of these people were also fascinated by all kinds of sect leaders, like Jim Jones, for example. He used to be often quoted in industrial music, and so. And but at one point, it turned out to be more serious, with Genesis P-Orridge becoming really a sort of guru, a cult leader. And this was the point when many left Psychic TV and started their own stuff. For example. Peter Christopherson, he left because he felt Genesis P-Arch was becoming a cult leader now. But I think the main impulse here is after you have gone through this complete negation, nihilism, destruction, you try to reach a point where you can find something new, where you have, and this new may be something very old. It may be a connection to an old tradition. It is primarily a question of expanding your mind. I mean, similar things have been done in the 60s, but here it had a definitely more darker side to it.
And could I just this
Yeah.
is probably a good place to just show this very quickly, since you brought up the 60s.
Yeah.
And we talked about the fact that this was before the internet. Because like I remember when I moved out to California in like 91, there were a few people I met when I was working at a copy shop, you know, who were professors, and they were like, well, you can try my email address. And I'm like, email, what?
Right.
So at that time we didn't have email. What we had was for these scenes, and I've talked about this in other streams, is we had zines, which everybody forgets that prior to the great shift of the appearance of the internet, we had the great shift that was fax machines, and more importantly, copy machines. Before copy machines were readily available to everyone, you couldn't do your own self-publishing. And what happened with the easy availability of things like Kinkos and copy machines and faxes, before the internet, you had a journal called Fact Sheet 5, and basically it was like a thing you subscribed to, and you would go to the different sections of it, and it would have listings of all the different subjects. So if you're into the occult, or if you were into industrial music or whatever, there were sections, and you would write to a PO box, and you would, in doing so, receive you begin a mail correspondence. And I did this for quite some time because I ran a number of chaos magic magazines at the time in the United States, and so and I was in the IoT and stuff, so I was corresponding with all these different people. And I just wanted to show you very quickly, this will only take like 1 minute, these are different things that would come in my PO box that I saved. You know?
Wow.
And all these were privately produced journals. They'd be stapled, they'd be produced on copy machines, but there were just a huge volume of them. They're all, you know, privately produced like this, like Temple of Psychic Youth stuff, where you get these things where people would put together stuff in Greek, and they would tie it with their own strings, you know, as their forms of binding. Some of were more cleanly put together, like Green Egg, which was much more like a neo-pagan kind of thing. There was a lot of the kind of anarchy journals and things that would come out. Some things associated with you know, musical groups, and they all had like private art and everything. And the reason I bring this up is because it's in the same thing of breaking it down, and also having your own form of rebellion where your modes of communication can't be controlled. It was all done through the post office boxes. So like bands like Crash Worship, or, you know, you'd have a lot of these were so-called, and often tongue-in-cheek, like you're talking about with Temple of Psychic Youth, although they got pretty serious. You know, you had things that were jokes like the Illuminati Motorcycle Club, and, you know, if you were in that motorcycle club, you got your special patch that would come with it. So this kind of stuff, and the outer edges of it, this is what brought this all to mind for me, is there was even like Zendik Farm. When you want to talk about crazy hippie 60s far out there crap, Zendik Farm was one of them. So at this time, everyone was carrying on, who was in these scenes, everyone was carrying on these sort of mail-based correspondences with zines. So here's the important thing to point out, is that this was a parallel system of getting your message out there that was absolutely not controlled by the powers that be. And in addition to the music, there was a literature, so to speak, and it operated entirely on the outside of things. So if you turn to Coil, you would have Coil, the music, you'd have the drugs, you'd have the social group, the small, a sub-collective, certainly, and they would be tied, for example, to the Illuminatis of Thanateros, or whatever, the IoT. Likewise, something like Ian Reed. If you turn to Temple of Psychic Youth, as you pointed out, then there was this association with the temple itself. I'm sorry, Psychic TV. You would have Temple of Psychic Youth. So what I'm trying to say is that it was a reaction to the control by this increasing media, and it was an exploitation of the new technological tools that appeared, like the copy machine and the fax, but it came as a complete picture. Nevertheless, it was extremely difficult to hear about this. Like back in 90 and 91, when I first heard about it, I had to dig and work. And if you wrote to someone, for example, in Britain, to find out about something, David Tibet actually always answered his mail. I got a few letters from him, and he really did. Everybody's like, he always answers his mail. I'm like, really? I wrote to him, he wrote back. But the thing is, you have to understand that this is airmail back in the day, where you had to actually write your letters on super light pieces of paper because of the expense. And you would literally wait, a month or more to get a reply from these people. So everything was slower. It was much more organic. But anyway, this was my attempt to paint a picture of the time. You wanted to talk about Current 93.
Yeah, well, first, the great collection you have here. These are real treasures you have kept over all those years.
There's more.
This is amazing. I don't have much of that kind of stuff, but I came later to the show, so I'm a bit younger, and I was also living in a different country where it was even more difficult to get this kind of stuff, to get the addresses and so pre-internet and all that. Yes, this is the fascinating thing. The once you discover this sort of scene and you find this fascinating people, these countless projects, it's like a huge samizdat, of everybody has a band, everybody has some tape out or some record, everybody has a strange, weird magazine and so. And this is also my feeling when I encountered this kind of stuff. It was extremely exciting because this seemed to me something that is really, really different from the mainstream and really
very
untainted by it. And it's also very international. There was a mystery about it, and it seemed to open up ways that were just different than anything else I had. So I mean, but going back to Current 93 to explain it a bit. So David Tibet, yes, he was a freak like all those others. He was also an extremely freaky person. Allegedly, he also did do a lot of drugs. And when Current 93 started, it was also in the vein of Throbbing Gristle, a noise music project. Nobody involved could play any instrument. David Tibet still cannot play any instrument, but the theme was a bit different. The focus was different. So the title of the band, as you mentioned, was taken from Crowleyanity. 93 refers to the numerological account of Thelema or of Agape, and so the Current 93 is the Crowleyan, current of the Book of the Law and all that. And he was involved in Crowley. And first, the group was called Dog's Blood Order, and
that's why the first album was Dog's Blood Rising, right?
Dog's Blood Rising, right? Yeah. And so it shifted, and the performance is very chaotic and crazy and aggressive. But he would very early on have his theme, which he has stuck to until today. The apocalypse, the end of the world. This also based in religious law and tradition. Eventually, later on, he would become more and more Christian. He would see through a Christian perspective, but the Antichrist was very early there, and first through the lens of Crowley, but that shifted over the years. So if you hear the early recordings of Current 93, there are these nightmarish apocalyptic soundscapes with lots of samples and noises, and they create this intense feeling of the end of the world is coming, demonic forces are taking over. And just recently I listened to them with earphones. I never did listen to them on earphones, actually. It was a great experience. It's really you plunge into a dreamy, nightmarish atmosphere, and this is what Current 93 was about. And David Tibet, he became close friends to both John Balance from Coil and Stephen Stapleton from North with Wound, and they were frequent collaborators with Current 93. So Stephen Stapleton, he did most of he was a good sound engineer, he was a good sound editor, so he's responsible to make Current 93 what it is. And he stayed with David Tibet for about 30 years. Now they have split. He's not in Current 93 anymore, but the quality of the sound of Car 93 was much due to Stephen Stapleton, but the whole concept, the idea was from Tibet, and all other kinds of people were involved at that early stage. There were members from Crass, for example, Steve Ignorant, he was on Dog's Blood Rising. Inexplicably, a guy from Killing Joke was also there at one point, Youth from Killing Joke. So Any Anxiety, she was also with Crass. So all kinds of freaks and weird people were there. And so David Tibet, he was doing this soundscape things until mid-80s. And it all changed when he met Douglas Pierce from Death in June. And this is the next group we should talk about. So this
is really kind of the time where we move from the chaos and the strangeness of the, let's say, early industrial. Correct me if I'm wrong. It's with a Douglas P coming together with Current 93 that we really start to see the neofolk appear. Is that right?
Yes, the folk aspect of it. First we have the noise. People who enter this kind of genre, they always puzzled how this combination occurred between the noise industrial and between the folky guys with acoustic guitars and romantic lyrics. But this is closely connected. It's also important to understand why it is. In a way, Psychic TV already outlines the route when they were going. Psychic TV sounded very different from Throbbing Gristle. There was really there were melodic songs in it, good music that you could also dance to, and sometimes folky elements. It was like Genesis Pure said, we discovered Leonard Cohen is the answer. We had gone to the furthest edges possible. Everything is destroyed. Where should we start now? So they start with, Leonard Cohen. Of all people, or Nico, and so. And with Car 93, there was a similar route. So now enter Death in June. So the history of Death in June, it starts with a band called Crisis. It was a left-wing, far left band in the punk band in the mid-1970s. And Douglas Pierce and Tony Wakeford were members of the group.
And Tony Wakeford went on to start Sol Invictus, right? Am I remembering that? Yes,
and Tony Wakeford was Sol Invictus later, and so this group was very political. So every song had a message, and they appeared, in political context. So it was really a far left thing, and Tony Wakeford and Douglas were involved in that, and they were responsible for many songs. So Tony Wakeford, I think he wrote many songs for Crisis. It was a great band. It's a really great band. I like it very much. And when they split from Crisis, they formed their own band, which was called Death in June. And this was a completely different thing. And the first lineup of Death in June was Tony Wakeford, Douglas Pierce, and a guy called Patrick Ligas. I hope I pronounced him correctly. And they would appear on stage now with military uniforms, white shirts, black ties. They had these military drums. The music was more post-punk, like, a bit Joy Division-ish. And they would sample all kinds of World War II Nazi speeches and so. And allegedly their stage appearance was frightening for many. I have a book from the mid-1990s called Misery and Purity. It was written by a Death in June fan, and it's invaluable because you can see a lot of clips from music magazines from that time, and from interviews from the band at that time. And what happened is that in the context where Death in June appeared, they created a great confusion because people were fascinated by the music and they did not know how this was supposed to be taken, right? Because within the context of punk and post-punk scene, you would have often fascist imaginary, like Joy Division did it, and Sid Vicious, he had the swastika t-shirt, and English punks, they would wear the SS death head, to piss off their parents and the war generation. And Death in June went a step further. When they were on the stage, you were not sure if they really mean it, but the songs were not political at all, right? They did refer in a cryptical way to things from Third Reich history or Second World War, but there was nothing like a message. There was no political message here, and the very name Death in June turned out was referring to the so-called Night of the Long Knives. This is when famously the SR leadership was disposed by the SS, and the head of the SR was a guy called Ernst Röhm, and he was also gay, and many people in the SR were gay. And as I mentioned, Douglas Peace is also gay, very open about it. And there was a fascination here, immediately clear fascination. And in the beginning, there was a more political content in it than they would later admit, because the idea that was lurking behind was maybe this is a sort of left wing of the Nazi party, the revolutionary, the Strasser right wing, and these were disposed by the SS, and then the dream of revolution was over. A thing like that, So the interviews of that time are notoriously cryptical, and the reviews in the music magazines are always like, wow, this is an impressive show. They're very talented, but what the hell do they mean? I mean, this is
right.
scary.
You're thinking to yourself, if I wake from dreams, shall I fall in pasture? You're like, huh?
Yeah.
How does that fit?
But this was a bit later. So this was the first phase of Death in June until, let's say, 1983, when they were more post-punk band. But within the context of that scene we're talking about, there was a feeling of everything is permitted, also Nazi imaginary, everything. You just can use anything and do anything. And so Death in June took advantage of this. So
and there was very, very much a phrase going around at the time, because you had the whole idea of Eris and the golden apple. And these were they were memes before they were called memes, because they were thematic and they appeared consistently. And one of them that constantly appeared, especially in the IoT circles, and I believe it came out of Bill Burroughs, probably. Don't quote me, but I think it came out of William Burroughs's work. But it's the idea of nothing is true, everything is permitted.
Yes.
And that was everywhere.
Yes, that was everywhere, and that was for some it was a liberation. It opened up many paths they could take now. And here's something as an important aspect about these people we are talking here. Each of them, in his own way, had a philosophy of total artistic expression, of a sort of radical individualism. And this is also something that attracted me when I was young. Like, I could see, okay, there are these bands, and David Tibet and Douglas Pierce, they are allegedly best friends. What they're doing is very, very different. One is doing this increasingly, Christian, melancholic Weltschmerz thing, and the other one is having this strange, Nazi Third Reich fetish, which is kind of scary. And they are friends, and they are strong individuals, and they have very individual projects. You cannot mistake them for anybody else. And the same philosophy was also there in Coil. You do something which is so much of your own that nobody else. And this was also the reason why they could get away with so many things. It was all in the realm of art at that point.
And it was all so much on the edges that most people just never heard about it.
Yeah.
And I wonder,
people didn't get it. When they encountered it, they didn't get it. They were completely confused about what the heck does that mean? What is going on here?
And a little parentheses, where would you put the Swans in this? Because you have the sort of, it overlaps with the goth stuff, but then you have Michael Jura later getting very, very Christian. And you have kind of a folky vibe. Would you put them in this picture?
Certainly. I'm not too knowledgeable about them. Actually, they're not a band that interests me much, but they are definitely part of that whole era and of that whole movement and these related ideas. And so now to get back to Death in June. So Douglas and David Tibet, they became very close friends, and Tibet was appearing on Death in June gigs, and at one point there was a sort of middle stage when Tony Wakeford left the band. Now, here's something interesting. The only member of Death in June that was never involved with politics was Douglas Pierce. He's, of course, the heart, the brain of the band. And Tony Wakeford, he did allegedly get close to far-right politics at that point. I mean, he was hanging out with National Front people allegedly, and there was an album which was between Death in June and between Sol Invictus called Above the Ruins, or the band was called Above the Ruins, and the album is crap, I have to say, but the lyrics are way more political than Death in June. It's clearly a right-wing direction, but Tony left the band, and allegedly there's a letter of Douglas, which is printed in the book I mentioned, to a music magazine, where he said they asked Tony to leave the band because he was becoming involved in politics. I don't know if that's true, but it seems like it's true that he was involved in politics. And later on, he got involved into many bad things like drug dealing, criminal scene, and he pulled his head out of his ass and created Sol Invictus, and he started all new as a musician. But this is a different story. So there was Tony, he left in, I don't know, 82, 83. There was Patrick Ligas. There is an album between the post-punk era of Death in June and the folk era of Death in June. It's called Nada, and it's more electronic dance floor based, and it's mostly done by Patrick, but it's split half Patrick and Douglas, and it's a great album. It's to me it's one of the greatest album of that whole scene of the 1980s, and Tibet was also on it already on a few tracks. So okay, so Tibet, he meets Douglas, and he is stuck at one point in this nightmarish soundscape thing. He doesn't get anything new out of it. You know, it's a kind of a dead end. And at that point, Tibet started to listen to actual folk music, and he encountered a singer, Shirley Collins. She's a famous British folk singer. She's still alive. She's 85 now. She started recording in the 1950s, and she would be singing actual English folk songs, and he became a complete fan of hers. And he also started listening to one album that he always refers was Forever Changes by Love. Love was a 1960s psychedelic folk rock band. And he decided he wanted to do something which is more like folk or pop music, you know, get out of the noise and so. And the one who could do it was Douglas, because he's one of the few from the scene who could actually play instruments. So he would play the guitar. And this is how this milestone album came about, which had the title Swastikas for Noddy. And this was mostly a collaboration between Tibet and Douglas. So they wrote all the songs together. Stapleton wasn't involved in it. And there were all kinds of other people on that album. There was Rose McDowell. She was from a Scottish girl pop duo called Strawberry Switchblade. She had this magnificent voice and this goth girl looks. There was Freya Eswin. She was this rune magician with a strange accent. And
can I tell my Freya Eswin story here?
Yeah, wait.
Okay,
you can tell it. I just have to paint the picture a bit more so we know what we're talking about here. And on that album was also John Balance was there from Coil. There was Ian Reid. There was Boyd Rice on it. So the whole bunch was on that album together. And this is it's my favorite album from Car 93. It's just completely weird. It has this apocalyptic. This was the apocalyptic folk thing. This was when it was labeled apocalyptic folk, and it's based on a saying by David Tibet when he was asked, what is this whole shit about? And he says, oh, we're just some apocalyptic folks, you know, folks, not folk. So people who had all this kind of interest in eschatology, in religion, in occultism, in dark things. And it's all in that album, which is one of the weirdest albums of all time. And I love it. And at that time, we come to Freya Aswin now. Yeah, this is the cover. A very dark, macabre cover with this rotting bird within these colorful flowers. And Noddy is a character from a children's book series. He was this how do you call it?
Doesn't he look like a little elf or a gnome or something?
Yeah. I don't know the word in English right now. He was this kind of goblin, you know. He had this red hat, and Enid Blyton was the author. And so David Tibbet, he got obsessed by Noddy, and it turned out the album had this title Swastikas for Noddy, and the release had the title Swastikas for Goddy. And so, I mean, this is a hard thing to describe. You have to listen to it. But at that time, this was the culmination, I think, of the scene. Freya Eswin, she had a house in London, and all these kind of weird people moved into that house. So at this point, Douglas and David Tibet, they were roommates. They had different rooms within that house of Freya Eswin, and also all kinds of weird people were living there. It was later described as you had occultists and drug addicts and schizophrenics. So it was just completely weird, and everybody who was sort of attracted to weird things in London would come to Freya Eswin's house. And Ian Reid was also living there, and this was this brooding, this brooding playground where all these people would meet. And here we have the photos from Ruth Bayer. She is an Austrian photographer. She made these photo sessions for Swastikas for Noddy, and you see Freya Eswin in front and Douglas in the back, and David Tibet, he has a shirt with Noddy on it. And on the right is Rose McDowell. Here's also Rose McDowell, yeah. She has this goth look, and she would appear on Death in June Records, Coil. She had also her own band. She would collaborate with Boyd Rice and all that. So,
is she the one who does the one of them is all alone and evermore?
Yes, she's the one. So this is the point when Car 93 completely changed direction and it became folk. And I remember that you told me that your favorite album of Car 93 is Earth Covers Earth.
Absolutely, nothing's close.
Yeah. And this is mostly made Tony Wakeford. Douglas, I think he played on a few songs, but the music is from Tony Wakeford, and the lyrics are taken from metaphysical poetry. Amazing poems. And on the cover of that record, there was a huge group photo of that. At that time, the bunch, you have all of them together in one picture in the forests. There's Douglas and Ian Reid and Boyd Rice and Stephen Stapleton and some women I don't know, and they look like the Manson family. And it's quite weird. But this was sort of this is the cover of the CD re-release. The LP cover was a bit different. I guess to me this is the picture where all this thing culminates. This is for me the peak or the quintessence of that 1980s neofolk scene, which came from this industrial music thing. And David Tibet was doing something interesting here because he sort of started to discover England again. And this might be interesting if you are a nationalist or so. Not to say that he's a nationalist, but you can be, let's say, nationalistic in a different ways, also in non-political ways, when you try to discover the soul of your country. And I think you have seen it on YouTube. There's an interesting film made in the 1980s, and you have interviews with John Balance and David Tibet, and he's there, and he has this really haggard face. He looks like a corpse, and David Tibet, and he talks in this monotonous voice, sort of T.S. Eliot-like monologue about how Western civilization is dead and done and empty and soulless and all that, and he wants to go to the East again, where he had lived in his childhood and discovered the spiritual traditions there he thought would be alive. So he went there to India or Nepal, and he wanted to study Tibetan Buddhism, but he came back very disappointed. And then he started to discover the traditions or the soul. Yes, this is the film. There's a bad quality of the tape here, but this is interesting, and it's also an interview I can relate to a lot. It's like a notion that T.S. Eliot had by the 1920s, the wasteland, that we are living in a civilization that has sort of lost its soul. And where do you find that soul? And David Tibet, he was beginning to find it within, through Shirley Collins, going back to England, to English poetry, to English traditions, and all that. And also picking the metaphysical poets for lyrics.
Yeah, it's a thing that struck me very, very strongly because I was just, it was like a punch in the face to read those lyrics. And I thought that he had come up with them. And that was actually the first time I wrote him. And when he wrote back, he was like, no, pick up the little penguin copy of Metaphysical Poets. And that's long now been on my bookshelf. And he introduced me to that. And I'm glad you brought that up because even though you could say he was leftist, this concern with tradition and this looking into the roots of the history and the culture was, for me, that's a thing that you would never ever associate with the left today,
Mm-hmm. Well, I would not consider him leftist at all. It's a sort of anarchism that was there on his part, and he also got sucked in by this thing Douglas and Friar Eswin and Ian Reid were doing, the rune thing and the Northern mythologies and all that. So he would appear on several Death in June albums. The most notorious is probably Brown Book, which was released in 1987. And this is an album that is extremely disturbing for many people. It had just this light brown cover and a golden SS death head as a symbol on it. And in a sleeve, it had this uncommented photos of Waffen-SS soldiers. And the lyrics were very strange and cryptical. So this is quite quintessential Death in June. You would not know how it was supposed to be meant. And when you dig deeper into it, you find a lot of contradictions and ambiguity. It's not a glorification. No, it's not a simple glorification of Third Reich things, but it's an exploration of the fascination that Douglas P. had. And he may have crossed the line to a more, let's say, emphatic or sympathetic view. So I don't consider him as a political person at all. I mean, to talk about Death in June, this would take hours. This was part of the fascination when I encountered these kind of groups, that Death in June was a thing you would get hooked on by the question, are they Nazis or are they not? And you would get hooked on it, especially if you had a problem with that. So the way where I came from, this was something rather shocking to me. Now, it was not easy to be reconciled with my worldview. I mean, my idea was, okay, Nazis were bad. And also I grew up in a country where you may have different feelings about these things when you are not German or so, because when you grow up in German-speaking countries, you always have this idea of an everlasting guilt and how the generation of the war did very bad things and how you are supposed to feel guilty about it, right? And this starts from very early on. And I think they're still doing it today. I mean, if you talk about children today, they're talking about their great-grandfathers, which is becoming increasingly absurd. But I remember when I grew up, it was quite intense, and I accepted this narrative. And through Death in June, I started to question it, right? Not in a sense that I would say Nazis are good now, which I would not say, but I realized that it's not a black and white thing. I realized there are more gray areas, and I started to read about, that time from different angles. And I needed to break free from this feeling of guilt, which was choking, right? And Death in June kind of helped me a way out there to understand things differently. And there was also another aspect to it. It was precisely this kind of aspect, this aesthetics, that made it so irreconcilable, is that the word, with the mainstream. This just was impossible to fit into the mainstream, because this is the one thing where you were not supposed to go when you had this sort of aesthetics and imagery.
And I should point out that was a thing that, again, saved it for a time. It's simply they could not absorb it. They could not contain and control it. So it had independence for a time that other movements of rebellion did not.
I mean, when they got split, so in the early 1990s, there was a split between Douglas and Tibet, and So they turned out into separate scenes. Like Tibet was absorbed in the mainstream later on, beginning with the 2000s, I'd say, maybe even earlier. And Douglas, he went into this other kind of subculture, sort of right-wing scene called the neofolk scene, where there were all kinds of bands who wanted to be like Death in June, or who imitated it, or who did different things and all that. For example, in Germany in the late 1990s, it was an interesting development. There was a label called Eis und Licht, which called Ice and Light. It was based in Dresden. And the guy who produced it, he was a Death in June, Sol Invictus fan from early on. And he came from the East, from East Germany, so GDR. And for those who grew up in communist Germany, this was a revelation to encounter this shit, you know. It was totally forbidden there in the GDR. And at the same time, they perceived in a very naive way. People who lived through the time, they told me how exciting it was if you get a tape smuggled, you know, from West Germany to East Germany, and you had the Cure on it and something forbidden like that. And some had the Blood Axis or Death in June or so. And this
can I ask a question about the ice and the runes? Like earlier, you mentioned, you know, that the whole thing of runes began to come in, right? And the sort of Nordic or, you know, Scandinavian or, you know, to whatever extent, Hyperborean vibes started to come in. And I remember that specifically with the IoT, you know, the Chaos Magic group with Peter J. Carroll and, you know, Ian Reed, I believe, was involved with it as well, and others. There was a big scandal of some kind having to do with ice magic, is what they called it. And the IoT, so it was said, was being taken over by these Nordic people who were, or Germans who were into this thing called ice magic. And it was a splintering of the organization with the English on one side and Peter Carroll, and then over on the German side, and this would have been about 91, 92, I think, probably 91. And at that time, because remember, I brought up the IoT as sort of this parallel thing where in magical organizations, they were having this smashing of what had come before and these setting up of new organizations. And we saw it with the music as well. And we've also seen that many of these musicians were tied to that world. You know, literally in the case of Ian Reed, or in the case of John Balance. And I think Ian Reed is turned into something of a rune master, you know, and is big into the runic lore. I wondered, is there more of that kind of like moving towards ice and Nordic stuff, or German? Is there more of a reflection of that in the music, since you mentioned these things? Because I never thought perhaps they have some parallel.
Well, okay, I'm not very knowledgeable about the occult side of this, so I would not know what ice magic is, but I can tell you that in the way these things were perceived, the scene in which was perceived, and as I told you, it was mostly within the realms of that Gothic music scene, right? These people who dress in black, and on one hand they listen to Susie and the Banshees and Christian Death, and on the other hand they listen to Death in June and Blood Axis, and this was the realms in which it was perceived, but the outlook was mostly aesthetic. So people would wear runes and ice crystal looking like runes and all that, because Douglas Pierce and others would wear them, and it looked good, it looked mysterious, it looked dangerous. The same way others wear, pentagrams or inverted crosses in the metal scene, for example. So I think the majority of the people who likes to wear these or use these symbols on stage or on record covers, they're not taking it too seriously. They have it more an aesthetic approach to it.
Right. It's just symbols that they've seen. And had you ever come across the name Ralph Techtmeyer?
Does that ring a bell? Is he a writer on occult things?
Yes, a German.
Yes.
Okay.
The name rings a bell, but I'm not aware of any book he's written. Yeah.
But you never heard of it in association with any of these new elements you're
I
talking
mean,
about?
I knew people who were dabbling with the occult and who were taking it serious and who claimed to have all sorts of experiences. I mean,
Right.
maybe you have more about that, but the way I realized, I saw it, this was more on an aesthetic level. And the same was true for the so-called fascist, aesthetics. It was aesthetics. And this was a thing which was also important for me back then and many others. We were just bored by politics. We hated politics. And if I looked up, I mean, I was never really a left winger or so, but I was just not interested in politics enough. And if I looked at what right wing politics means, like the Freedom right wing populist party in Austria, it was just, I thought it was appalling, it was banal, it was not anything that interested
I
me. And now
hated
I
it.
see, and now I see all these things. It's outside the realm of politics. It's on a poetical. I think poetry, the poetical approach is an important thing, because many people, they are fascinated by the aesthetics of fascism and of Third Reich and so, and they are not so much down with the actual politics. They are appalled by it and so, but they cannot deny that there is a visual quality to it, or there's some mystery about it and so.
Hugo Boss designed uniforms.
Of course, yes. So, and there's an old story that David Bowie used it, or many mainstream musicians, and Mick Jagger did hang out with Leni Riefenstahl, and it was cool to say, "Wow, I watched Triumph of the Will 30 times," and so. So you see, there's of course a connection to mainstream pop and fascist aesthetics, and so. So this is a thing you can also get into. It's an aspect of the whole thing. You would read, for example, Susan Sontag, and she had this essay, Fascinating Fascism, where she would write about Leni Riefenstahl and why her photographs of African warriors are also fascists, right? Probably Leni, she thought, damn, how can I get away from this? I just photographed some black people, and then, but no way, they would say this is fascist as well, because you glorified this male athletic body and so. Or Susan Sontag, she would also write on Sieberberg, Hans-Jürgen Sieberberg. I mean, he's also a German film director who was quite a great inspiration for later generations of neofolk. So the aesthetics is an important thing, and as far as I was concerned, it was mostly about aesthetics, and for the majority of the people inside that scene or who were fascinating with it was also aesthetics. I mean, I'm actually one of the few people who crossed the line and who got involved more into actual politics. This is when I started to read right-wing writers like Armin Mohler in Germany or Ernst Jünger, and I realized, okay, this is so far removed from what I conceived as being right-wing until now, Julius Evola and so. This is just a completely different thing, right? And but I'm one of the few people who did it. Most people would stay within these realms of aesthetics, and within these realms, also Death in June would be accepted. Like I remember, I had a friend in my Berlin days back then, and he was also East German, and he was a total communist. He would also always vote the post-commie party. But one thing we could bond about was that he knew all the Death in June songs by heart, and he was a big Death in June fan. And this united us beyond ideology, because we perceived it as art, and this is important. So, and yeah, I got lost here a bit, but I want to point this out because I mentioned this Eis und Licht label, Ice and Light, and it was not ideological at all. It was also not occult at all, but it was more, referring to a sort of emotional aesthetic quality. German people, yeah, they like things having to do with mountains and with forests and so. Yeah, I mean, especially the East German people I got to know. By the time I was living in Berlin, I got into contact with lots of people who grew up in East Germany, and they were teenagers in 1989 or so. And what fascinated me is that they had almost a completely different mentality than the West Germans. They were more naive in many respects. And here's the thing, this is really a kicker. They were less brainwashed about guilt for fascism than the Western were. And the reason was that the official ideology of GDR was, we are the good Germans. Hey, we are communists now. We are on the right side of history. We do not need to atone. And in the West, they did atone, and so we did so bad things, and we have to. But in the East, they did not do this. Of course, they had anti-fascist movies and anti-fascist books, but they did not feel bad about themselves. And also, the GDR, they incorporated a lot of things that were quite similar in the Third Reich. Like they had this youth organization that wore uniforms. They had there was march music playing all the time in the GDR. A friend of mine told me, and there was a sort of patriotism. So they all had this in, and when they encountered the neofolk music from England, all this kind of stuff, they often didn't get the lyrics or anything, but they had an emotional response to it. And then in a sort of creative misunderstanding, they created their own stuff. And this was a wave that started in the late 1990s through this label in Dresden, that you had German bands who were influenced by Death in June, Karl 93, and Sol Invictus, but they used German lyrics. And the style of music was also more austere and more serious and less occult and all that. Sometimes the lyrics would be a bit stiff and corny. You had the feeling they're taking themselves very seriously, unlike the Brits, who always have this sort of black humor detachment. But hey, this is a German character. And this was very popular in that particular scene in the late 90s, early 2000s. Bands like Forseti, Darkwood, Oplead, and so. I was not a big fan of them. So my heart got stuck with the British, the English guys, And I did not. Yeah.
Would you say, are you familiar with Hilmar Orn Hilmarsson?
Yeah, sure, of course.
Or whatever. Where would you fit that in to this picture? Or how
well,
would you?
I don't know so much about him, but he was the Icelandic chapter of Temple of Psychic Youth in Iceland, and he was also Asatru, as far as I know.
Right. So he was doing recordings and recitations in Icelandic of the Eddas and sagas, right? Am I remembering that right?
Yes, I think he did. I mean, he made this specific connection, saying, okay, I'm doing what Psychic TV is doing, but in that way that I'm connecting with my own Icelandic Northern traditions. And he was the one who introduced Friar Aswin to David Tibet. So this is also where
you've got good gossip in there. You know more about these little details than I do. Nice.
I just refreshed it. I read it up again in those books, so I refreshed my memory. And so maybe some things I say are not entirely accurate. Don't take my word for it. But as far as I know, it was him who introduced Friar Aswin to David Tibet. And of course, they made a record which was called Island, which is very untypical for Karl 93. The music is Hilmar Örn Hilmarsson, and Björk is on it as a background singer, which is amazing. You have Björk on a Karl 93 album,
and that was when she was
a teenager.
Huge. Or
no, it was before she became huge. She was a teenager. I think she was already huge in Iceland, I guess. But before she became internationally huge, she was a background singer on that album. And it has a strange,
so she must have still been in the Sugar Cubes maybe at that time.
It was 1990 or so. The album is from 1990.
Yeah, that would have been Sugar Cubes.
Yeah. So, but I'm not too knowledgeable about who Hilmar Örn Hilmarsson.
So. However, that was the other thing. All us Americans were like, "What the fuck do we do with umlauts?" We're like,
Death in June made a joke out of this by using umlauts on the albums. There's this album called The World That Summer, and it was printed with lots of umlauts. The World That Summer. So you could imagine a weird pronunciation of this. So. Well, so the aesthetic label the aesthetic thing was important, and of course this created also new ways. Aesthetics is not something to be taken lightly, I think. I mean, for me, it also still is above politics, but let's say the left-wingers are not wrong when they say, it is also leading people on a path they're not supposed to go. And with Death in June, it was definitely the case that it did lead many people on a path that they were not supposed to go. But this was, as I say, for me, this was also a fascinating thing. It was accepted within that scene. Within that scene, it was okay to have an interest in that, or an affirmative interest in that, even if for many it did not go that far. And I think, I mean, in that scene, I'm kind of lost for words here, but what I want to say is, if you look at the mainstream scene, the mainstream is very accepting of far left ideas, of far left aesthetics, of anything that comes from the left. It's there, it's mainstream, it's okay, And sometimes I imagine, what if I would live in a culture in which right-wing things are more dominating? They don't need to be the only thing around, but more accepted. Like Death in June would be an accepted band or so. And then I sometimes think, maybe I wouldn't like that. Maybe I liked the point that it would be something outside. Maybe this was more attracting to it. And I was feeling a bit disappointed when Current 93 and all the others in the early 2000s, they became more mainstreamed. I noticed this when I was living in Berlin. It started with Coil. Coil appeared in Berlin at Volksbühne in 2002.
And that's when they were getting, they were basically becoming friends with Trent Reznor, and they were getting more popular.
Yes, this was also
that first album of theirs.
This was certainly. I mean, Christopherson, he always had connections to mainstream pop and rock because he was this director of video clips. So there was always a gateway. But it was Christopherson himself. He used to say it's important to be an outsider. If you listen to his interviews, he always claims how important this position is, because you have a different way to look at the world. And I like this very much. I can relate to it. I mean, I always have felt like an outsider to mainstream society. Sometimes I liked it. Sometimes it can be very demanding, because, of course, even if you are not making music, if you are, let's say, an intellectual, what I supposedly am, you do want to have recognition, you do want to have influence and so on. But on the other way, it keeps you pure in a way. It keeps you alert.
Yeah, and, it's much more difficult to be a whore when you're not being paid well.
Absolutely,
right?
Absolutely. And I could see that many of those, most of those groups I adored, they had a certain integrity. They would just do their thing, and they would get a lot of shit from the press. I mean, I remember in the late 1990s, the witch hunt started in Germany. We were this gothic scene, and we were listening to this kind of stuff, and nobody among us considered himself to be political. And all of a sudden, these articles appeared in left-wing magazines that were telling us how fascist we are, and they explained to us many of those names that were mentioned in the booklets or in the lyrics or on the covers. So it was in a left-wing magazine when I first encountered the name of Julius Evola and the book Revolt Against the Modern World. And it was more like, that's interesting, right? They wrote this article right, to make us look bad, but they had lots of interesting names dropped, and they created the opposite effect by publishing these articles. The scene, which was not really political before that, became more political.
But tell me this, when was this?
This was about 1969, 79. I remember the first articles appeared.
Wait. You weren't alive in 69.
No, 19... I mean 96, of course.
96. Okay.
Sorry,
it's so strange to think that they in Germany they were calling goths. I mean, I was a little younger, so we were called death rocks. Like the term goth had not yet appeared, but they were calling goths fascists?
No, even worse. I mean, the name we used there were Gruftis. Gruft is the German word for a tomb, right? And we realized, okay, the English word is goth rock or so weiter. And it was within the context of that scene, of the Grufti scene, that people were listening to Death in June or Current 93. And it created a subset within that scene. People who all of a sudden, first they started in dressing up like Ross Williams or Robert Smith, and then at one point they started to dress up like Douglas P. They would don up uniforms, they would cut their hair short, they would wear strange runes on their jackets and all that kind of stuff.
That argument that I heard back in the day among the death rockers in America, they're always like, "Who's your favorite, Roz or Valor?" Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So it created a sort of, let's say, rightish or right-wing subset within the goth scene.
And just out of since you're a German speaker and the rest, did they think of sister? What was the association for politics of Sisters of Mercy, if any? Because I think of it as being sort of left-wing and sort of international, but
we did not have that back then. I can't recall it. I mean, later on, I learned that Andrew Eldridge is a sort of lefty. It doesn't really reflect much in the lyrics and so.
So that was still neutral. So Sisters of Mercy
it was completely this was completely neutral, and even listening to Death in June and all that was this is important to understand. This was a realm that was not supposed to be political, and there was one point of reference, I call it, which would help people explain to the outside what was going on there, or explain it to themselves maybe. And this was this Slovenian group Laibach. Yeah. So Laibach is
life. Yeah.
Yes, and this is a special case because Laibach, they came from a communist country. In the 1980s, they dabbled. This was their shtick, They had fascist or communist totalitarian aesthetics, and they applied them to banal rock, pop songs. Like,
and you could never figure out if it was right or left. It had elements of both.
Exactly. But pretty soon, it caused quite some irritation. But pretty soon, it was accepted also in highbrow culture. Okay, they are doing a sort of ironic, critical thing here. This is a commentary on the inherent fascism of pop music or whatever theory you could find here. So Laibach would be accepted in that mainstream. You said, oh, we know what it is about. And then you could explain and say, Death in June is something similar. They have this game playing with symbols and with all that, but it was different in fact. If you were inside, you knew there was something different here going on, and it was hard to fathom what it exactly was.
And just the choice of symbols would make it more threatening to most. So yeah, well, I wonder, but we still have a bit of time, depending on how long you can stay with us, but I wonder if we can move to the ending of this movement. If you can maybe sketch how it, in your view, came to an end. I think when we were speaking offline, you were saying sort of like the end of World Serpent Records or whatever. Or for me, it's the appearance of 9 Inch Nails sort of killed the earlier electronic stuff and made it mainstream. The Head Like a Hole, that first 9 Inch Nails album sort of made industrial go mainstream, and then you have things like Skinny Puppy and the rest that are just not the same thing. So if we can sort of put the closing on this, since you've already talked about the opening, then I was thinking maybe we could sort of step back and look at what was this thing. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sure. Obviously I'm improvising here a bit, and there's really a lot to say here because it's such an esoteric thing. But to sum it up, what appealed to me back then, when I was like 20 years old, first, it was not a thing that was not consummated by the mainstream. It was really something else, and it seemed to be something very promising. And I still share a certain general feeling that many of these groups professed, like a dislike of mass culture, a feeling that mainstream culture or Western civilization has lost its soul, has gone empty, and you look for something different. you do not find any pathway in traditional religions anymore. So you try other ways out, be it through music, be it through occultism, be it through some sort of strange artistic obsession you might have. This was, by the way, I think Douglas Pierce was perceived most of the time as a guy who had a strange obsession with things which he put into art, into sort of transcendence. You see, I think this is the most important thing. You look for a transcendence out of this increasingly narrow and shallow culture, right? And I still have this basic notion about our culture as it is now, right?
And just to think, I'm gonna shut my camera, but I can still hear you, just to let you know.
All right. Okay. Good.
Yeah.
Why did you shut the camera?
Because I'm gonna go get a cigarette, but I can still hear you where I'm going.
All right. I see. Okay. So this is the way I want to sum it up, very broadly speaking, right? So in this way, I can emphasize with everybody who is trying to find this way, even if I would not approve of many of these ways, or if I would say you pay a price for it. For example, if you do it through drugs or to some sort of kind of occultism, these are things I see obviously quite different than I used to. But the most important thing is, here is something happened that has to do with art and with people who are strong individuals, and they just do their thing and they don't care about what the mainstream says. I mean, I had mentioned before that in the 1990s there was starting increased pressure by left-wing press. Antifa would try to boycott concerts. They burned down, I think at one point they burned down the tour bus of Death in June and all that kind of thing. So there were attacks from Antifa on the goth scene, saying in the goth scene there are these right-wing fascistic elements, they need to be purged. And we inside the scene, we felt misunderstood. We felt it was all wrong, and we got more radicalized by these attacks from the outside. We loved our bands even more. We wanted to find reasons to defend them, and at one point some of us got interested in these things they dropped at us, saying, oh, this album by Sol Invictus is referring to Julius Evola, revolt against the modern world, and he was a fascist. And say, if you hate him, there must be something interesting about him. So you look up for the book, which was not easy to find back then, and then you discover something completely new. So you see the mechanism that was going on here. And I know I'm digressing here a bit, but I'm aiming at the point you asked me, when did it end? But I'm trying to sort of all the elements that were at work here. And another thing was this, by imitating these groups and these people, like many people started to imitate Douglas Pierce, you were also trying to get something of their charisma. They had charisma. And Douglas, I mean, he was a genius. He was a sort of charisma merchant by that, because he would never talk politics, or only slightly. He would never be open. He would never say, no, I'm not a Nazi, or he would not say I'm a Nazi. It was just up to you to guess, it was your choice. He would say, I'm doing art, and you do with it what you want. And this projected a certain charisma of ambiguity. And many people who were in the scene and who were drawn to this, they wanted to copy it. They wanted to be like that. They wanted to have also this charisma. And this is when all these kind of copycat bands got started. And at one point you had bands, guys with black shirts and strange armbands and guitars, and they were trying to be Death in June, and they were very vaguely fascist in their aesthetics. But if you ask them, they would disavow, or they would draw back, or they would not say anything at all. So this was a kind of shtick,
Yeah, didn't Ministry pick it up? Like Ministry was more industrial, but remember they had that one song with the Sieg Heil, Sieg Heil.
I think this
ripped it off, didn't it?
I think this came from a different source, because I mentioned David Bowie before. There was always a sort of fascist aesthetic stream also within mainstream pop music or metal music or so. I mean, this kind of elements were floating around everywhere, but they had a certain special quality within the tiny neofolk scene. And
But
what shall
ministry
yeah.
is tied to the industrial, which is tied
But
to
ministry is total left wing. Ministry is
right.
super,
No. But
yeah,
but they were sort of ripping off elements of it, and I think of that as being when it sort of when other people picked it up.
yeah.
Ministry coming out of Chicago with Wax Track Records, and then it all just sort of went.
Yeah, I mean, I guess we didn't talk about Boyd Rice here. I mean, Boyd Rice, he was also member of. I mean, he was with Death in June. He was on a few Car 93 records. He collaborated with Coil. He's this provocative trickster personality who also played the stage Fascist a lot. He dabbled also a lot in this sort of aesthetics. His music is basically this absolutely crazy noise. And I think he did have an influence on many groups who would not admit it. I think this kind of stuff did influence, of course, Marilyn Manson and also Rammstein. Rammstein would be a ripoff of Laibach in many respects. I remember when Rammstein came out, for Germans, it's a bit ridiculous the way they sing and the way they roll their R's. It's like tongue in cheek. But I imagine that but I imagine when Americans hear it, they think of Adolf and they get this cozy shiver along their spine and think, "Ooh, this is exciting and edgy." I don't know. I wouldn't know. But certainly Rammstein, they had adopted some of those elements as well. So yeah, I mean, it's also known that Marilyn Manson knew Boyd Rice, and the Church of Satan is another point where those people would meet. And so, I mean, this is a very difficult story here. But, to get to the point about when did it end, I mean, I can only give you my very personal view how I experienced it. But I remember in the early 2000s, the scene in Austria and Germany was quite vivid still, and it became more and more internationalized. I remember in 2002 there was a festival in Vienna, and it was organized by Albin Julius of Der Blutharsch. Are you aware of this group, Der Blutharsch?
No, but it sounds fancy when you say it. Der Bluthaus.
Yeah,
Is it the blood house or something?
Nein, it's how to explain it? It's from some medieval expression for a sort of military troop, which was I don't know, especially bloody and furious. And der Blutharsch emerged from a group called the Moonly Hidden Beneath the Cloud, and they did this pseudo medieval, very dark ambient music, or they had songs that they dealt with the Crusades or with witch burnings, or all things medieval in a very dark fashion. It was a great group. It's one of my favorite groups of all time. And when they split up, Albin Julius, it was a duo. There was a guy and a girl. They were a couple, and when they split up, Albin Julius, he made the Blutharsch, and this was more in a military style, much influenced by Death in June and by Boyd Rice, and he also became friends with Douglas and with Boyd. Albin and Douglas, they made a great album, which is very unlike Death in June. It's more like Albin Julius. It's called Take Care and Control. It was released in 1998, and this is the last great Death in June album, in my opinion. I think it's really fantastic, but it's unlike anything else from Death in June. It's more this sample-based electronic music that the Blutharsch was known for. And now he had a record label, and there was a big festival. This is one example. In 2002 in Vienna, and it lasted for 2 days, and there were bands from all over Europe coming. From France, you had Dernière Volonté, you had groups from Italy, you had groups from Germany and other countries. I remember the feeling back then was there was a European, a pan-European scene, a pan-European underground. And these groups were not connected by an ideology, but just by a certain outlook on the world, by certain tastes. I mean, of course, the fascist aesthetics were big in that, but it was not necessary. You did not have to do that to become a star in that scene. It was sort of accepted and popular, but it was not the main thing. And I remember how vivid and how incredibly interesting that was. And there still was no absorption by the mainstream. In the meantime, the old bands like Current 93 or Coil, they would go more mainstream. Even a band like White House, if you're familiar with that. White House was also there in the very early days, 1980s, and they had this savage noise music, which was the vocals were just screaming about serial killings and sadism, and this is really terrifying stuff. And I remember how all of a sudden they were also invited to play at Volksbühne, and before that they were just unthinkable. This was just completely untouchable. It was regarded as absolutely evil, real shit, people who are not posers, who actually love serial killers and whatsoever. And all of a sudden they play at Volksbühne in Berlin. And they were also part of the circle from Car 93 and North with Wound and so. And at the same time, these old groups were going more into the mainstream. There was still this underground scene going on in Europe, and it did not last very long, to be honest. So I don't know. I think the last great concerts, I kind of personally lost track, I must say. You know, there were many things that were the reason why people lost interest or no new bands would pop up. I think many just could not stand the pressure, because the pressure, this left-wing Antifa pressure on the scene, was really stifling at one point. I mean, if you got in touch with that scene, you would risk your reputation as if you were an actual right-winger. You were in danger that Antifa would burn down your tour bus or ruin your equipment or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's a specifically German thing, or maybe continental Europe thing, because there was just nothing like that. Like even in the days when there were still skinheads in the US, like in the late 80s, they didn't give a shit. They showed up at punk rock shows and would just try to start fights in the mosh pit, you know, and that kind of thing. But we didn't have, there was, I mean, Antifa didn't exist in the US at that point, as far as I can tell.
It's a quite recent thing, Antifa in the US, no? Yeah. I mean, we had it already in the 1990s and the 2000s, and many of the musicians, they were not free anymore. They always had to say, yeah, I'm interested in this kind of politically non-correct writer and in this kind of non-political correct aesthetics, and I love runes and so, but I'm not political. I'm not. They always had to distance themselves, so they had to say, I'm just an artist, leave me alone. But still, they would not be left alone. You know, they would always constantly new articles appear about how evil the scenes is. Whole books were written about it. You know, I remember there was a book called Ästhetische Mobilmachung, which was all about the scene. It was written by some left-wing Antifa guy, and all the bad guys were in there, all the bands who did something naughty, and most of the bands were actually not right-wing at all, or not even political. So
you know, it's interesting that we were talking about Marcus Wolf from Crash Worship, and you were telling me that he had what's that new project?
Waldteufel was the subsequent project.
Right. And when I went looking for him, because we used to be at least acquaintances, you know, superficial friends or whatever. And when I went looking for him, he's now on all these websites attacked by Antifa in the US. So I guess for once we've imported something from Europe instead of the other way around. We've now got Antifa here chasing down people they claim are right-wing musicians.
I mean, I remember that Boyd Rice or Michael Moynihan of Blood Axis, they would get in trouble with Antifa in Denver. In certain parts of Denver is I think an Antifa or left-wing center, and it already was in the 1990s. I think Jim Gold also has some stories about Antifa being around in the 1990s in that area, in that particular part. But it certainly wasn't as big as in Germany. And in Germany, there's another thing which is just happening now in the US, that it was supported by the state institutions that were funded by the state, institutions that were supposed to fight against right-wing extremism. And so these people, they got money, they got attention, they got all kind of backing from the state to fight these tiny scenes. These were tiny scenes, and these were scenes that were not really particularly right-wing. They were just full of freaks and freaks like me,
right,
but the thing is, these scenes were tolerant of right-wing things. You could move there because there was an anything goes atmosphere. There was an openness of mind. There was the love for the music. As I told you, with my commie friend in Berlin, we just bonded over Death in June songs. And I remember we spent the night on a hut in the mountains, and we got drunk, and we made a Death in June karaoke and so on. This is the kind it worked, but some people from the outside hated it. They didn't want to see it. They didn't want to see anyone being different, enjoying different things. They just cannot leave people alone, And this was I think it was a stifling effect on the scene, and eventually, I think in 2016 there was the last concert, Runes and Men. It was a festival in Germany. I think 2016 was the last time they made it, and Douglas Pierce was appearing, and he's now this old granddad with a big belly, and he has a white mustache, and he's just this funny old man. There's nothing mystical about him anymore. Back then, when I was a Death in June fan, there was really something strange and mystical and charismatic about him, and he was also a very good-looking man. So no homo here, but he was. And now he's he's kind of cute, He's this old granddad. And David Tibet also, he's just as freakish as ever, but he has now this beard and this strange locks, and
still has that crazy voice. Yeah, I'm like, is he?
Yeah, he has. I love him. I love him. The thing is, I did not follow what he's doing ever since 15 years or so. This new stuff just doesn't really interest me. And I saw him live, I think, in 2005, also in Berlin. So Karl and Siva invited, also again, Volksbühne. This is a big the theater in Berlin, very mainstream. And Card 93 was supposed to play there, and I went to see them for the first time. And it was kind of, on stage you had 9 people. Everybody had an instrument playing. There were also he had these trannies now as friends. He had, there was this guy Anthony and the Johnsons, and this was released on Tibet's label, and this became very popular, very mainstream. And Tibet got straight, into the mainstream with associating with these kinds of people. And so you had these 9 people on stage, and they played old Card 93 songs or new Card 93 songs. But it was just, for me, for my taste, it was way too much. The music didn't add up. It was not really good. It was supposed to be beautiful and epic, and you had lots of instruments on the stage. But it just didn't work for me. And then when people asked for an encore, they wanted to have more, all of a sudden, Michael Cashmore enters the stage. He's the one who came after Douglas for playing the acoustic guitar on Card 93 albums. So Michael Cashmore enters the stage. He was living in Berlin back then. And Julie Wood, she was a violinist also in the early 1990s, late 1980s at Card 93. And it's just these 2 of them and David Tibet, and they sang, I don't know, about 2 or 3 songs as a da capo. And this was magic. This was great. This was just the Card 93 I loved. This simplicity and this folk song thing and this mysticism. But when he had a whole orchestra on stage, it just did not work. And I saw them a second time a few years later, and the selling point of this second tour was that he would play stuff from the really early noisy soundscape area, and it just did not work at all, because you realize he was too old for it. You could realize his heart wasn't in it, and this whole bourgeois mainstream setting didn't work for it. To play Dog's Blood Rising, you need a 20-year-old freak on speed, and you need some up cellar where only some psychopaths gather and so on. then it works, you know. But it didn't work in that setting. It was just terrible.
Yeah, I think I had not thought about the idea of official pressure, but I guess in Europe that was a very real thing. In the US, they went the typical route, I believe, of just repackaging it and offering, like I said, you had your Nine Inch Nails, your Skinny Puppy, your Ministry, and Scraping Fetus, and all these kinds of bands that appeared and sort of absorbed industrial. And then I guess a lot of some of those edgier people, I remember some of them going in the direction of Nick Cave. What's his name? Blixa Bargeld, went over to Nick Cave's, and then you had the closest thing to some sort of musical authenticity, I guess, was people like PJ Harvey, but it was much, leftist and complaining, and, Sheila and the Gig was about women. And I guess Nick Cave kept doing his thing about, murderers and folk songs, but it didn't feel like the birthday party. He just became huge, and so all those things just sort of dwindled off. I wonder if like the 4AD records were like an aspect of that, with the Vaughn Oliver designed covers and things like Dead Can Dance and the rest. I guess you could sort of follow some of the folky going back to authentic roots stuff with a band like Dead Can Dance, but then they became very international. It was all internationalism. It was all world music. It was all globalism. This is the same time that that Peter Gabriel did that Real World or whatever with his rainbow logo, and it just all went very global very fast. And I remember then it was all world music all day long, world music.
I mean, when I told you, when I experienced this second wave of the scene, early 2000s, I told you there was this connected scene. And if they had one thing in common, they would say, we are European. There was this European feeling. The word European had a certain aura and magic for us at that point. It was very vague, right? But at the same time, it wasn't. At the same time, it signified something that was other than that, what you talked about, this globalist world music kind of stuff. It was the idea of creating something very distinct, something which is also not ironic. I mean, there was, of course, there was also a space for black humor or tongue-in-cheek or so within the scene, but the main thing was we are being serious about this.
It wasn't.
This is not a joke. This is not a joke. I mean, we are maybe not political, but we are not a joke when we say. I mean, I remember that mid of 2000s. Douglas Pierce said, there's a great European movement. And I mean, it was just our tiny scene, but in his mind, it was something much bigger, and a European rebirth, so to speak, of a spirit, of an aesthetics. I know it's all very vague, but when you feel it, when you experience it, then you know what it is about. And he said, and I'm proud to be part of that movement. And so, and this was the feeling of that time. It was something distinctly European. It was not leftist. It was not mainstream. It could not be consumed by the mainstream. And this was the exciting thing about this, right? And I remember there were times when I hoped it would create a sort of revolution. It would become, I mean, I was young and stupid, but impressible, but I was so enthusiastic about it. I felt this is some spirit that will create a new sort of culture, and I was happy to be part of that underground subculture. And it was dead in a few years and just lost its vigor. And it was partly outward pressure, but also the decay was from the inside. There was also this usual infighting, like people who were friends within the scene, they just fell out with each other, just as Douglas and David Tibbett fell out with each other. And so at one point, everything disintegrated again. And I guess today there are still a few acts around, and I have lost contact. I'm not sure how it's working anymore, but one thing that was important was that you would meet up for the concerts and for the parties in real life. It would not just be an internet thing. Of course, internet would play a role, but it was really important to have these festivals and people meeting up. And this is really dead by now, I'm afraid.
Well, let's take a look at do you have still a bit more time?
Sure, as much as you like. I mean, I could go on until the early morning hours, but I guess your audience will get very tired.
Well, I'm certainly happy to have you and very much enjoying the conversation. I think there are a couple of things I want to look at. I sort of want to, try to go meta on it to figure out what the movement was and why it so strongly had the occult aspect associated with it, because it was very strongly present. And I also want to do sort of an honorable mention. This was from the United States, but this was a band that I was very much into. I guess the best way to start on these intertwined subjects, and I'll mention the band that I wanted to just put in here as well. That's Crash Worship, that Marcus Wolf was in once upon a time. I was probably 19 years old, and I was very much into all the different occult stuff. I'd looked at the Golden Dawn stuff. I'd done the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram for a year, and kept the Magical Journal and the Dream Diaries and all that kind of stuff. And I had met different people who were doing magazines and producing stuff, and people who'd written books like Donald Michael Craig, books on ritual magic and all that kind of stuff. And then I came across the Current 93 stuff and Nurse with Wound specifically. And at that time, I mean, you started talking about this with Nurse with Wound, but if people have not heard it, these days it probably wouldn't really have an impact. But in those days, as I said, you couldn't turn on your computer, and I mean, you could connect to a BBS, I guess, but there wasn't any email. You had to look really hard for these things. As I said, you had to find an address and mail something to it with an actual stamp, and you had to wait for it to come in your mail.
Wonderful.
It took
absolutely wonderful.
Yeah, and you had to actually want it, because you had to go to the post office and pay and figure out the address and write it and then send a money order or whatever and then wait. And I remember the first time I heard Nurse with Wound, I was like, what the fuck? Like, just literally, like, because I did have headphones on a lot of the time then, and they weren't the little ones like this. They were your crappy little Walkman headphones, the big 70s over-ear ones that had the curling telephone cord that went off across the room. And I remember hearing it, and the impression it made on me was just like, oh my God, something's going on here. Even Dog's Blood Rising, which I heard early, and to be honest, I didn't like it that much, but you would just listen to it and be like, damn. And so there was very much the sense that you had come into a very special area, and the idea with when you're younger, you're looking for a sub-collective that you can, find the right signals to show, it's like the old, when you see punk rockers at a punk rock show, you'd see how they painted their jacket, and I'd like, for example, if they had Crass painted on the back of their jacket, I'd just get the fuck away from them because it was just disgusting. But, I was hanging out with the people who were into the Fiends and the Crimson, that called themselves Fiends, the Crimson Ghost and Misfits and Samhain, Sawan, November coming fire. So you're always looking for some sort of tiny sub-collective where you can know the parameters and you have been permitted in. It's almost, I guess what I'm after here that I'm having a hard time saying is that there was an aspect of finding the music and knowing about it and being able to find others who knew about this very obscure stuff that was almost like an initiation itself. You almost felt like you were in this special group because you knew about this crazy stuff. And that, I think, is what drew me in when I was young. You say you were late for it, but I only found out about it around 1990, 89, 90, 91. And only for like that little 3-year period was I into it, because by 92, I was sort of done with my superficial occult phase, of being a member of an order and having a degree and knowing secret hand signs and, all that kind of crap. But I think there was that. It was the idea that you, as a young person trying to have a form of rebellion, found this thing that was very separate and very esoteric and very difficult to get into, that had all its, secret knowledge associated with it. And then there was the international aspect, because it was before the internet. But I'm very much tied to people online now who are from Britain, and I was thinking about it recently as we were talking about doing this discussion, and I was like, why am I sort of have this thing where I'm running alongside the Brits and talking to a lot of them, and I find many of them interesting, like Woes, for example, Scotland or whatever, and AA in England, and from Wales or whatever. But I was like, wow, that's exactly what happened back in the day when I was beginning to, I met Peter J. Carroll, and I got initiated into the IoT and stuff. And he had this German woman with him, and for the US side of the order. And I just realized now I'm corresponding with all these Brits. Like I said, I went through my papers and found a letter from Ian Reid and the guy Charles Brewster, and I guess
now you can tell your friend.
I can tell my Freya Aswin letter. When I met Peter Carroll, I had one of my friends who was also into this he's got Swedish blood or whatever, so he was way into runes. It was runes all day long. He gave me my first copy of the Old English rune poem and all that, and he had a copy of Leaves of Yggdrasil, and I looked on the back and I was like, damn, old Freya's pretty hot. I was 19 years old or whatever, but and she was very much older at the time. But I was talking to Peter Carroll about that, and I said, man, she looks pretty good. And he looked at me and he said, he had a damn Chaos Star belt buckle. Peter Carroll had a Chaos Star belt buckle. Anyway, he looked at me and he said, she would eat a young boy like you alive. And I was like, okay, that's pretty cool. So I figured out what her address was. And that was the other thing, that I was writing to all these British PO boxes, and they would all say like BM Wound London, with the little numbers. They all had BM, and then they had their name like Wound. And so anyway, I wrote to Freya Aswin, and I said, would you like to go out on a date sometime or something like that? I said I'd been speaking with some British occultist or whatever, and blah, blah, blah. And she wrote me back. It's dated 23rd of July, 1990. It says, Dear Semyaza, which was the secret order name I was going on, one of them anyway. She said, thank you for your letter. Most interesting. Who is this prominent English occultist with whom you discussed me? For your information, yes, the photo on the book looks rather good. Nevertheless, it should be visible that I'm past my 40th birthday, and so far as my appetite is concerned, I have a nice husband, and that will do me. So far as correspondence is concerned, about what? And then she signed it, yours unobtainable,
Ice Maiden.
Right. I love it. It's crazy that this thing is yellow.
No, I think this is awesome. It's so great you have this stuff.
Right.
It's hilarious. Right. It's really great. I mean, this is the payoff now that you had the audacity to hit on her.
Right, as a 19-year-old.
And now 30 years later, we get the payoff that we enjoy this letter.
Right, and I have boxes full of that shit, like all these old letters, like I said, from the Pact or the IoT and stuff. And as I said, I've got all those German documents on ice magic and the scandal and all that stuff. But anyway,
but may I interrupt? I mean, here's the one thing that would really interest me is like, what was it exactly you were looking for in these occult things and in these orders and so?
Well, I mean, there are several things, and I guess I'll cover my part first, and then we can jump over to the broader theme, because this is the question of what all of them were looking for too,
Yeah.
For me, it was the idea that I could break out of where I was in the Southeast, which was, kind of like a backwater, so, where I was living, you would basically, where things that were cool in London or in New York would arrive 2 years later, and so there was the idea that I could reach out and correspond with these other people. And I was also very, very interested in magic. I felt that there was some secret thing, some secret knowledge that could help me to see through all the crap around me and to understand what my purpose was. I mean, it's the normal kind of things like a kid asks himself. You're like, oh, well, I think back as far as I can remember what was there before I was born. I can't remember before I was born. My memory only goes back that far. What came before, or questions like, what is my purpose in life and all the rest. And because I did not grow up in a family that was religious in the normal sense, I grew up in a family on my mother's side that was reacting to religion and therefore pushing it away because she had been raised in it, Catholic. And then my father was very much, I grew up with him reading the Tao, doing weird things, talking about auras and colors and all kinds of weird stuff with like logic diagrams and all kinds of symbols. He's constantly writing things down on pieces of paper and trying to understand secret wisdom crap. And I guess some of that came to me, but really I guess there were two things. One is the idea that you would have a community of other people who were interested in such things so that you, quote unquote, would not be alone. And then the other aspect of it was that it would be secret knowledge that would help you to understand what is truly of consequence instead of all this superficial crap. Remember, we're coming out of the 80s at that point. We're coming out of like big hair and, Al Pacino snorting piles of coke in his gangster movies, Scarface. And we're coming out of just, remember what was on MTV at the time. For those who are old enough, that crap started with the Buggles, and you're listening to bands like Squeeze or what was that damn, God, I'm so old I can't even fucking remember shit. But whatever that, what are words for when no one listens anymore? And the chick's got damn speakers over her tits. It was just all stupid and crazy. And you're just like, what is more? So I'm just rambling. I'm not giving a very good answer, but I think there was the idea that there was an international community. I had a correspondence with people around the US. I had a correspondence with people in Britain. I sometimes wrote to people in Australia. Like I've got stuff from the IoT temples, where people are writing to me from Australia. They're writing to me from Germany, so you felt like you were in this international group, but it wasn't like, Freemasons. They were all like chaos magic. They were like wild. It was punk rock, man. You mash it up. It's like a Brian Geisen cut up or something. You just tear it apart. And at the same time, I'm reading things like Naked Lunch or, the Western Lands. So it was rebellion. It was finding a group you could be in with, but ensuring that group was secret and small enough that it was special, so that you could know you were a part of something special, and the idea of a secret wisdom and the rest. And I think that that was probably most of it. But for me, it only lasted a few years. Just to wrap the part about me, and we can jump to the rest of these people.
Yeah.
For me, it only lasted a few years because, hell, a lot of it was writing to David Tibet and having him point out the metaphysical poets. And I was like, wait a minute, why do I need to read someone else interpreting, somebody like John Donne or Henry Vaughan, when I can go read the originals, and when I finally got the, I discovered that one thing from Hourglass for Diana, it's actually called On an Hourglass by John Hall, and I found out that he was a buddy of Cromwell's and, and I memorized the poem, my life is measured by this glass, by all those little sands that through pass. See how they press, see how they strive, which shall with greatest speed
and greatest quickness fall.
Right. And so I was like, wait a minute, I don't need to, these thirsts for knowledge, yet how is it bought? With many a sleepless night and racking thought. These ruffled rich silk, though never so gay, a well-plumed peacock is more gay than they. Poor man, what art, a tennis ball of error, a ship of glass tossed in
a sea of error. This is
it's just like, mwah. And so
how slippery are their paths, how should I fall, how art thou nothing when thou art most of all.
Yeah, you forgot issuing in blood and sorrow from the tomb, crawling in tears and mourning to the tomb. Yeah. It just, I was like, wait a minute, I don't need the new stuff. I need to go to the old stuff. And so there was a very quick thing that happened for me where I just completely left all of it. Like the IoT, they got in this ice magic argument and I just sent them all a letter saying, you're all fucking ridiculous. Leave me alone. I want no more part of this. Well, there's one thing I should put in. There was this band I wanted to mention, Crash Worship. They had a very strong impact on me too, right before I left all of this. And I was also listening to, like, you probably know Diamanda Galas, and I got to see her play live in San Francisco and stuff. It was all very dark. It was very heavy. Crash Worship just immediately, they were like an American version of all of this, but they did their own thing. They weren't derivative, really. Crash Worship was the closest thing to being a part of this, but in a uniquely American way that wasn't just like a pastiche or a copy. And so they were a bit different. You'd go and it would just be roaring loud music. The first time I went to see them, I was bringing them to Atlanta. I wrote to them. I said, hey, I'm into magic and stuff, and I'm into Japanese drumming, taiko drumming and stuff. They're all a bunch of drummers, Marcus and Simon Cheffins and some of these other people. And I was writing with Marcus, actually, because he was handling the correspondence. And so he said, yeah, we'll come to Atlanta. We'll stay with you, do a show there, help us set it up. But we're going to do one first in New Orleans. So my friend and I hopped on one motorcycle. He had this 6-cylinder or 4, I don't know. It's crazy. It's more than 4-cylinder motorcycle, like some kind of Goldwing type touring one. And we both drove down to New Orleans through the night, arrived there for the show. And we're waiting outside this dump place in New Orleans to watch them play. And the whole place is packed. Remember, I'm 19 years old. I'm a young kid. I'm like, this is the cool thing. I'm with the real people. I'm going to the crazy thing. I'm going to the esoteric thing.
Yeah.
And we arrive, and this little venue is packed with people, but there's no band on the stage. The lights are on the stage. The stage is sitting there, but all there is a giant table. And it's covered literally in a mountain of freshly baked bread. I learned later that they had bought it that morning from the bakery. So the crowd's sitting there and they're looking up at the stage, and there's just bread, loaves and loaves and loaves of bread. And of course, the smell of bread coming off. And then we hear this noise from somewhere out in the street. This is downtown New Orleans. This is the French Quarter. And I hear these damn bagpipes and drums. And we're in the venue. We're like, what the fuck is outside? Right. And from several blocks away, this procession with like sparklers going and torches and people painted white cavorting and these weird drum sets that are like hung over their shoulders that they can carry like a marching band drum, but they're made of like crappy, shaped metal that's been bent and sanded. And they're playing these drums. And in front is this guy playing a set of bagpipes and this crazy procession with no amplification. The guy playing the drums and the bagpipes going and the torches and, yowling and shit. And they force their way in through the back of the crowd, pushing people to either side with these torches and music. And then they climb up on stage and start playing. And so
what was the bread about?
The bread was just one of their crazy symbols, poetic terrorism, or, this in these days, people were reading Society of the Spectacle and, the idea of poetic terrorism or, incongruous.
But say, later when Markus Wolf made Waldteufel, the pagan aspect was very strong. I mean, he seemed to be also very serious about it.
There were different elements involved because the personalities were very different. Like Simon Cheffins later was doing things with Burning Man, and I got the feeling, I don't know, maybe he was more leftist. I think Marcus had his own influence,
but the pagan aspect was not forefront in Crash Worship. Or it was
I would say that it was very much forward, but never talked about. So I didn't get to the
because I thought of the bread as a sort of offering or sacrifice or
absolutely, it would be symbolic of those things,
some kind of symbolic meaning,
or that you would be participating in a kind of Last Supper, right?
Yeah, or like the miracle of the bread multiplication,
right? Or the transformation of the host, right? But that's the whole point, is that you could sit here and you could say it's 10 different things. It's also the smell of something freshly baked that you would associate with home and comfort. And yet this chaos is about to break out, because that's why I say their shows were very much paganish, because what happened is the place just went ape shit. They would start playing and it's just a roaring wall of drums and these like weird detuned instruments and crazy homemade instruments. I mean, if anybody wants, you can find it on YouTube. You can go listen to like Discordia or Bayrava or whatever. They've got a number of them. Just do a search for Crash Worship and you'll find some of their music. And they're basically they're stage diving into the audience. They had this chick Heather, who I ended up becoming friends with, who was like she tagged along, and the band is called Crash Worship. She would I just saw that in a comment I'm answering, and she would just come stage diving off of the stage into the audience, which is cavorting. Women are taking their shirts off. There's just fire and smoke, and they'd like one guy would come running in with a hubcap tied to a rope with like a fire burning in it and run through the crowd. Some people would partially get set on fire. People would fall over. It's all pitch black except for the torchlight and this roaring wall of drums. And when Heather would dive into the audience, people are covered in white flour, looking like something out of a voodoo ritual. And they'd had these big bags. They'd take the bags from inside box wine. And so as they're crawling across the audience, like someone who's stage dived but hasn't fallen to the floor yet, they're pouring wine into everybody's mouth. So it was kind of a bacchanal. It was very dissolute. Ultimately, today, I'd call it degenerate, but it was, and it certainly was in its way, but it was also an experiment in terms of breaking and shattering.
Yeah. I still feel not comfortable about calling many of those things degenerates. Looking back at it, because I feel they serve a purpose. I prefer to think of them as something Dionysian, bacchanalian. So in my worldview, I mean, I'm not a pagan, mind you. I'm more like,
nor am I.
I'm more like a David Tibbet. I'm more Christian inclined, but in my worldview, both Apollo and Dionysus have to be worshipped. They are both legitimate, so they have their time. There's a time for Apollo and a time for Dionysius. Chaos and order, and I think these sort of ecstatic things and events and experiences are important in anybody's life, especially when you're young.
They're breaking and they're initiatory, and they combine with
absolutely
the reaction of adolescence to that which has come before. I've often talked about it. There's an age you get to where suddenly you become difficult to deal with. Your parents don't like you anymore. You don't like your parents anymore. You reject everything. And I think it's biological. You're supposed to reject what has come before to a certain extent, and your brain is in a different chemical soup. And then you get to a point eventually where you've reacted and rejected, which allows the culture to push its envelope and experiment some. And then you eventually come back around. Like I often joke about it, where you come back to your late 20s, and then you're at a point where suddenly your parents can give you good advice again, and you recognize that they know things, and that's Apollonian versus Dionysian versus Apollonian. And I guess this is a good point to come over to, instead of talking about myself, I wanted to mention Crash Worship because they had a huge impact on me. I really dug. Marcus was a cool guy. Love to talk to him again if he ever sees this. But basically, jumping over to these people, I think what happened is you talked about it with like Throbbing Gristle and the rest. It was to shatter everything.
Yeah.
And it was chaos. And it was like, what comes out when you break everything? And it's almost like a calm after the storm, where with the folk music, I mean, I remember tripping up on top of a mountain one time, listening to Hourglass for Diana and that whole Earth Covers Earth album. Like it really, when Rome falls the world, all of those songs are just hammered into my psyche, because it was like after the chaos, there's suddenly this quiet. And though I have to say they've got some bad pitch in spots, like all of these neofolk singers, you're like, are you sure that's quite the note you think it is? Because I'm not sure it is. I played that Rose McDowell nursery rhyme about, one of them is all alone and evermore shall be so, for Anna Maria Alberghetti's daughter, who I was dating. So her mother's an opera singer and she can sing opera. And I played that and she was just like, just turn it off. It's all the pitch is wrong. It's all flat or sharp. It's all wrong. So even though it was amateur in many respects, it was still beautiful and honest.
Yes.
And it was like, after all the chaos, there's just this honest. So, and a lot of that comes through with the Death in June stuff too. And so I think that they went through a chaotic crash and smash and breaking. And out of that Dionysian transformation, they seized for a guide. And in the case of the Coil crew, who are also in the IoT, also very dark. I mean, if you listen to, I mean, look at Love's Secret Domain with its Austin Spare style sigil stele, but with an ejaculating penis, you know, on the cover. I mean, they went down a dark road and they never pulled up out of the nosedive, right? They just straight into the cliff wall, you know, with the plane.
They paid.
And you would expect that with, I mean, those things, they have a trajectory, right? But as crazy as somebody like David Tibet is, he clearly he clove to, or he directed himself towards mysticism, it seems, and a personal experience of religion. And even though, you know, really, the last album of Current 93 I bought that I listened to is Thunder Perfect Mind. Like, really, Current 93 for me is that album, Earth Covers Earth. That's it. And it seems like he found a way, although that one about the May Rain or whatever, I think it's on Thunder Perfect Mind. That's, yes, like, it is. There's ones that have kind of almost a lullaby or a folk song feel. Like they found something and they stuck with it. And so you can, you know, make fun about David Tibet for becoming more mainstream or whatever, but he saved himself from absolute destruction, and he's found a path where he's at least himself and there's happiness. You know, he didn't fly the plane into the cliff.
Yeah, but he often says that he had, in fact, lost his interest in Crowley and Crowleyanity very early on, and he regretted that he had to keep up the name Current 93.
Yeah, forever. Yeah.
Forever, because it had become a brand and all that. But you can see the shift. So in the mid 1980s, that the earlier stuff is very angry, very aggressive, and you can see he's fighting with Christianity. There was this the single "Happy Birthday, Pigface Christus," and it was also, music was by Douglas, and it was I think the first Current 93 record in which there was an actual song where David would also do vocals and sing. Before that, it was just these noisy atmospheres. And I remember I sent you this. There's a really fascinating documentary. For me, it's fascinating. It's done in the 1980s by some fundamentalist Christian, and it's about the evils of rock and pop music and how much Satan and demonic stuff is in there. And there's also a section about Psychic TV and Current 93. And at one point, they show the Crowley Mass mini album, or 10-inch or so, yeah, to document David Tibet's worship for Crowley. But what they didn't get is that this album was not mocking Christ; it was mocking Crowley. And if you are familiar with the song, it's like making fun of all this. So it's another October morning, a wretched morning, a cold October day. It's Tomegatarian's birthday, and
I know it.
It's basically mocking this Crowley thing, in fact. And David Tibet famously became more serious about Christ and Christianity, more in a heterodox way. It's not really sure what he actually does believe, but he's deeply, I think he's deeply moved in these feelings of salvation, of compassion, always again the end of the world. And so I have here a line in that book by David Keenan, but I read it to you. There's a statement by David Tibet in an interview. He says, "If anything, all the work I have done and the music that I love in other people is about innocence. What I'm always hearkening back to is a lost sense of innocence." So he remembers often his very, very happy childhood in Malaysia. "So the thing about England that I love is the England of Shirley Collins' Anthems in Eden." I mentioned she's that folk singer he became obsessed with. "It's just lost childhood. All the people I admire the most are all innocent, with no complex theology or complex ideation within their worldview. Everything I love is essentially simple." This is the road he took from the mid 80s, and I can sense it. Early David Tibet, there's a maliciousness in there, and Death in June certainly is often very malicious. But with him, he's going for this thing, this lost childhood paradise, the innocence, and maybe the glimpse of divine things you may experience in your childhood, and later when you grow older, you unlearn them, you don't see them anymore. I mean, speaking of metaphysical poets, do you know this one poet? His name was Thomas Traherne. Thomas Traherne.
I think
He's
so,
al-
but you'd have to give me a line
yeah,
from it.
he's also in the Metaphysical Poets collection you mentioned from Penguin. I have it here in my hands, by the way. And
Was it recommended to you by Tibet as well?
no, I found it by myself, and then I discovered, oh, this is the poems I know from Current 93.
Right. Great poems in there, right? I mean, amazing.
Yeah. So Thomas Traherne, yeah, this book he wrote was called Centuries of Meditations, and there's one particular strong part where he describes how when he was a child.
I can still hear you. I'm gonna go get it.
Yeah.
So I can read along with you.
Okay. So he in that book, there's a strong part in that book where Thomas Traherne describes how when he was a child, the world would look like the Garden of Eden to him. Everything was eternal. The stones on the pebbles on the ground were like diamonds, and the people, they looked like angels. And so he describes this mystical sense of perception, of being in a paradise, of being connected with God and with innocence. And then he goes on to describe how he unlearned this, how he was the world of grown-ups, kicked him out of this paradise, which is a paradise of the mind, essentially, right? And he had to learn the ways of the world, and he had to, forget about the magic and all that. And then in this chapter of the book, he says all his ambitions are now to undo this learning, this grown-up learning, and to become like a child again, also to connect again with this mystic revelation he had when he was a child. And all his mysticism of Thomas Traherne is about that. And in David Tibet, you find very similar things. Also, his obsession with nursery rhymes and with childhood things, and it's always soaked with this incredible sadness and melancholia and grief. And these were things I could relate to very, very strongly. It was also through David Tibet that I found many books or writers to discover. He would often quote some writers in the covers of the records, where the text, the lyrics are, and then you have quotes from some philosophers or mystics or so, and I would look them all up and I would find my way. And this is something I could connect very well, this sense of paradise lost, and at the same way of innocence lost, and of yes, a threat also of evil forces. I mean, he has always been obsessed with the apocalyptic vision of the end of the world, of antichrists. I'm not that mystical myself, right? But I can follow this emotion or this feeling. I mean, I'm not saying that I think supernatural forces do not exist. In fact, I do believe they exist. I'm not sure in which way they manifest. But for example, what has happened in the last 1.5 years with this whole Corona insanity has a demonic quality to me. No, I'm not that guy who's so big into conspiracy theories, and so I find them interesting, and many of them are obviously true. But I saw people who are very reasonable, down to earth, and even they said, all this feels like a chap, like straight from out of the Revelation of Saint John, right? So this idea that there are evil forces in the world and they are threatening all the things that are good and innocent, I find this in David Tibet's work a lot, and this is something I could also relate to, you see. And this leads us very far from politics or from traditionalism or anything like that, but I think for me personally, it's connected with that, and it goes maybe even deeper. because here all the theological questions arise about man's fallen nature, about man's purpose, about what comes after heaven or hell. I mean, this is all the things that the metaphysical poets were also concerned with, or occupied with, and so. This certainly was a part of the attraction of this kind of music or this scene, that these things were a thing. Metaphysical things were a thing. They are not a thing in pop music, right? Only in a very superficial, stupid way. Or you can go maybe into heavy metal music, or you can find some satanic symbols in Miley Cyrus videos, and so
burn down
this is
some
horrible.
state churches.
What?
Burn down some churches. Yes. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I'm not recommending that, by the way. I'm referencing.
No. It was also a terrible thing to do, because these were very beautiful churches. But the thing is about these guys you're alluding to, they did have a spiritual quest, which I can relate to. I mean, I think they did lots of stupid and even terrible things, but I also can say they were in a way serious about it. And here you have music and you have artists that are serious about metaphysical things. Isn't this great? This is completely anti-mainstream, because the mainstream hates metaphysics.
Yeah, it's absolutely flattened and materialistic. It has to be because of its little materialist dialectic,
Absolutely. You just have to stick to this world. You don't have to look beyond. You don't have to ask yourself questions about the meaning of life, the destiny of your soul, about all these kind of things. And this was also something that fascinated me. At least you try to go beyond it. I mean, of course, if you discovered many of those bands or artists, you would find out they are a bit disappointing when you get to know them better. Or for some, it's just an act, or for some are just stupid people who try to impress others. But this is what is so different about David Tibet or Douglas Pierce. You could tell they were serious about what they were doing. They were sincere and serious about what they were doing.
And they paid their prices to walk their path. But luckily, unlike Coil, and unlike, for example, also, I mean, Genesis P. Orridge did not have a happy end. I mean, he turned into a wreck, an absolute travesty, a joke, a miserable, cut up, distorted, fake-breasted, drug-riddled. I mean, it was a nightmare ending. Somebody in the chat had earlier mentioned G.G. Allen. And there is also that, there's a very distinct thing I saw when I was coming up as a teenager. There are certain people you meet and see, especially if you're involved in death rockers or drug subculture or goths or punk rock. They all, there's a certain number of those kids, and you know them when you meet them, when you're at that age too. They're on a one-way trip to destruction. And they, whether it'll be that there'll be an acid casualty, they'll become schizophrenic, they'll die choking on their own vomit, or, they'll get in a fight and get killed, or a car wreck, or they'll end up in prison. There are just a lot of people like that. And the Coil group, basically, it looks like John Balance had a version of that. Genesis P. Orridge certainly seemed to be going this way. I don't know. People might watch this later, and I don't know these people, so I'm guessing. And whatever. People who do know them could come in and correct me. But David Tibet and Douglas P., just to come back to your point, they seem like they at least found a way to stay alive. They lived through it. They lived through the dissolution, and they continued as best they could their quest. So I guess that's as good as it gets.
As I said, I'm not following Card 93 anymore, but I just recently checked what David Tibet is doing right now, and I can tell that he stayed true to himself. This is certainly true, and also his religious quest is pretty much sincere. And what I love about him is that he has kept this ability for enthusiasm, which he would always find
a childish enthusiasm. He's not selling himself falsely.
Totally, there's something childlike. But this is what I was talking about. You keep a spot inside yourself where you have this connection to this paradise, this Garden of Eden, this childlike part of yourself, which is innocent and which is probably this one thing that can keep you alive, that can save you, that can keep you open for this enthusiasm. So I found that he still has always something to obsess about. There were so many things he had been obsessed about in his life. One time it was Noddy, then it was Shirley Collins, then it was before it was Crowley.
Somebody mentioned the cat images, you know.
Yes, cat Louis Wayne. This is the painter of cats who became insane and all that. So, and this is wonderful. I mean, if you have an ability to get this enthusiasm, this can keep you up. This can keep you somehow in contact with the things that matter. I mean, the downside to it seems to be obviously that Tibet, also Douglas, all of them, they all suffered heavy depressions, and it's reflected in the music. Lots of darkness and depression. Also in Death in June, this gets very, very dark. And sometimes you are in a position in your life where this darkness can feel very cozy or even inspiring, because it corresponds to something within yourself. And if people want to play uplifting things to you, it just turns you off, or it just puts you even more down.
I have a whole circle of friends like that, where we'd be working in the office, and this was in the beginning of the days where everyone was digitizing MP3s. So you had a giant mass of music in the office, and you could just put it on autoplay. And like everybody I worked with wanted fucking melancholy, sad shit. Like they get angry. You know, there's some, if you put on anything that was cheerful, you know, it's almost like the darkness was something other than nothing. You know, like the last place you can take refuge in this nihilistic shit is in darkness.
But it doesn't have to be. I mean, the darkness doesn't have to be nihilistic. There are different shades of darkness, so to speak.
Well, that's what I meant when I said that it's something other than nothing.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it's through the darkness you get into contact with what is lost. It's the grief about the lost paradise. It's the grief about the dead, God that died, or whatever it is. And through this grief, through this feeling, you can sort of grab it again. And I often found some kinds of dark music very uplifting. To stimulated something metaphysical inside me, I would say. You have to have a penchant for this. I mean, I have friends who cannot understand how I can listen to this and that stuff and find it uplifting and inspiring. They feel dragged down, but it's an alchemy. It's something inside you that responds to something you hear, the music you hear. Maybe in Sanama time, your mood is different, then you will respond differently. But listening to music creates an alchemy within the soul. And whatever is in your soul will respond. And sometimes it can be very healthy, cathartic, as they say, right? If you play happy music to a grieving man, you will just hurt him. But if you play music that expresses his grief, you can heal him. You can have a cathartic effect on it. And Car 93 had this effect on me a lot. Today, not so much. I mean, except the songs that are written into my mind. You know,
right.
I know them so well.
They got encoded at that.
Yeah, they got encoded. They immediately stimulate this response inside me. But when I listen to other stuff which is not so much encoded, it just drags me down. I say, okay, Tibet, stop this whining. It's terrible.
Right.
Enough. Right.
Right. That happened to me with Led Zeppelin. Actually, I was tripping one time listening to Led Zeppelin, and I'm like, oh my God, Robert Plant does nothing but whine. Yeah. And then I realized his whole aesthetic is a whine. And now I can't hear Led Zeppelin anymore. I'm just. Oh, by the way, this is just a side thing since we're getting close to the end here. And I'll invite you to, whatever your final thoughts on all this are. But I do want to ask, in terms of melancholy music, I had totally expected that Millennial Woes would be all into like heavy melancholy music, right?
Purple
melancholy music. No, I know, man. I was totally like, let's talk about melancholy music. And he's like, nah, no melancholy music. It's all cheerful. And see, that's why he's still woeful, is because he won't listen to dark music, which would provide him the catharsis. That's my guess anyway.
I'm not so sure. I mean, I think his tastes are more refined. He does like also melancholy music, but uh, not as much as I do. I mean, the majority of stuff I listen to is more like that. But I need to have it cold in a way. I don't like it to be more like ice. You know, how shall I explain this? I, I mentioned this guy or this whatever you call it. David Tibet was helping to become famous in the early 2000s. Anthony from Anthony and the Johnson, and he's a tranny, right? And he has a magnificent voice. One has to admit it. But he's obviously a very troubled person, you know, about gender identity, even before it was cool. And so, and I saw a concert of his or her, whatever the correct pronouns are, also in Berlin, and I just couldn't stand it. It felt horrible. It was like dragging me down. It was too fluid, you know. It was too much Schmalz, as we say in German. Yeah, and I needed to be icy, like I can walk across it, not like a swamp of feelings where you are dragged down. This was like a swamp of feelings where you get dragged down and you feel sorry for yourself, and it's terrible. More like a Joy Division song. The grief and the pain is there, but it's frozen like ice, and you can walk over it. And this is what I like. This can be very uplifting. No, but not this. This is for girls, maybe, yeah, who enjoy these kind of feelings. You know,
It's perhaps your Teutonic rationalism. Yeah.
Maybe, yeah, maybe it is. As I said, the different kinds of darkness. I don't like to. I don't mean like dwelling in negative feelings of pity or grief or so. I hate that it has to be more subliminated. You know, more pushed, like metaphysical poetry. You know, you have it all in a very you have. It's also about feelings, about anguish, about grief, John Donne, but it's pushed into this. Now that I'm saying it, I realize that John Donne is much like Joy Division or some Joy Division songs. When I think, I mean, John Donne, he was also fighting with heavy melancholia and depressions, and then he has these poems that are so clear and crystalline, and they have this intellectual power. You know, there's a thought in it, and so this is what I like. It's not dwelling in the feeling of melancholia, but sort of elevating it to something
and sublimating, like you said.
Yes,
and that's originally, you probably know this, but for viewers who don't, you know, the Metaphysical Poets, and this is the edition, by the way. This is the one I bought when
I have the same. Wait, I have to turn the camera on. Wait, look.
See?
I have it.
Across space and time, you know,
across space and time, yeah.
And that's why I said at the outset, you know, I was thinking about using that image, the Metaphysical Poet image, because I think that there is something about the Metaphysical Poets that carries across to what we're talking about, and it's the part about being serious about it. And anyway, what I was going to say about the Metaphysical Poets is, I can't remember who it was. It might have been Ben Jonson. I don't remember. Some English literature scholar can correct me, but basically they called that poetry metaphysical in the sense that it was pretentious and intellectual and hard. They called it strong lines in the sense that it was something you had to chew on. And that, I think, is maybe what you're talking about a little bit with the idea that it shouldn't be too muddy and emotional.
The romantics. I mean, I love also romantic poets in English, like Shelley or Coleridge, but I don't love them as much, you know, because they go more into this direction of this dwelling in feelings and in moods and so on. I like to have it more intellectually crystallized, so to speak, and the metaphysicals are perfect for this.
And there's a sense of consistency through it. It's not that the image came to them strictly from the intuition. It's always an image that came from the intuition, otherwise it wouldn't have a reality to it. And yet it's been shaped by the intellect, saying that this piece, though it came by inspiration, has been shaped by the intellect and then painstakingly fitted together with this other piece that was shaped by the intellect, but it's almost like there's a Renaissance thing where they would find, it was a tradition, and I wish I could remember what it's called, because then I could do a search for it and find examples. If anybody knows, tell me in the comments. I put it in the actual comments later because I won't look at the chat again. But there's a specific tradition where they would find something that was like the burl of a tree, the part of the wood above the roots. And they would look and see that it had sort of what looked like a face. And their tradition was to carve out the face that they already saw that was there. So it was like they were revealing it rather than making it. And I think that's the idea, is that the intuition and the intellect work together.
These Renaissance people were all Platonists, you must remember,
yes,
right?
Yes,
and there's also in best of metaphysical poetry, you often have a very clear philosophical or theological idea, and then it is like almost in a mathematical fashion, it is translated into these images and thoughts, and there's always like a Platonic idea, this thought behind each poem, which tries to sort of illustrate, is maybe not the right word, but you can always have a clear conception there.
And the term would be that it would bring down, in a Neoplatonic sense, it would bring down that inspiration and manifest it somehow.
Exactly. I remember allegedly Michelangelo, he used to say a similar thing, that he said the sculpture is already there in the stone. I only need to remove what is not necessary. So his David statue is already there. He can already see it like a Platonic vision. And now the easy part is just to remove everything that is not conform with that idea. And it's in there in the stone. It's the same idea that you just mentioned with the piece of wood and so.
Yeah. And I think that is a good way to sort of sum up what these people were sometimes consciously trying to do, because having been informed by the idea of the occult, that is very much Neoplatonic,
Sure. I mean, the occult presupposes that there's a sort of invisible order, as with a metaphysical order which we can participate in a way through the adopting of systems or of rituals. But I don't know about chaos magic and all that. What the metaphysical concept of the world is there, maybe the world is
chaos. Actually, it was the arbitrariness, the absolute relativism and arbitrariness, which is why I got out of it so quickly.
But this is a departure from classical magic from the Renaissance time, which was Platonic. It was
Neoplatonic. Absolutely, yeah. And when right-wing people talk about the great chain of being, that's really just Neoplatonism,
Yeah, and these classical magical traditions, they presuppose a world that has a secret order and a harmony, and not just chaos. But I mean, just to mention it, we could go much deeper here, because all of this, what we're talking about, you already find, for example, in Nietzsche. This Nietzsche in the 19th century had already reached a point where you think that the foundations of culture as it is now, they are already exhausted, they are empty, they are bad in a way, and that which is falling should also be pushed. That saying from Nietzsche, it also appears
in philosophizing with a hammer.
Yeah, yes. It appears in a Death in June song. That which is falling should also be pushed. That which is crawling should also be crushed. But I think Douglas P. added that line. And so there's this idea that the old established forms are already dead. They're already empty. You don't need to subvert them anymore, but because they're just not alive anymore, you just have to break free.
Philosophical accelerationism.
Sort of, yes. And then you get into the chaos, but you just dive into the chaos to find a new harmony or so. I mean, and certainly you find this also in so-called conservative revolution. It's a sort of a name for certain thoughts of right-wing thoughts after World War I, which were mostly Nietzschean, like Oswald Spengler or Ernst Jünger or these kind of guys are associated with conservative revolution. But they had the same notion to say that the old world that existed before 1914, the political order and the values, they were all destroyed by the war. And now something different has to follow. You cannot restore it. This was the difference between reactionary right, which wanted to restore the old order, but the revolutionary, the conservative revolution right, wanted to get to a new order and had very Nietzschean thoughts. So I see a parallel here, an aesthetic parallel in the development from industrial to neofolk, that first you go through the storm of steel, which annihilates anything, and then you start again. You discover harmony again, you discover innocence again, you try to renew this, and so this exists together in that kind of music or the kind of scene. You have both the storm of steel, and you have the noise, and you have all that, and then you have the acoustic guitars, and you have
and then the May rain comes.
When the May, that is by the way a cover of a song from a krautrock band from the 1970s. It's called Sand, the band, and this is a cover version of it. But it has this apocalyptic feeling when David Tibet thinks it. Whenever I listen to this version by Card 93, this comes to my mind. The May rain is something that washes. It's also spring. It indicates spring, right? So it's a typical thing that does obsess right-wing people or right-wing philosophers for a long time now. This idea that maybe if you reach the darkest hour, the dawn will come, you have a rebirth, all these theories of history being a cycle. You have in René Guénon or Evola, you say Kali Yuga, we have to go into the depths of Kali Yuga, and then maybe Golden Age will come again. All these kind of ideas are related to this. And
I was going to say, I think the point about aesthetics fits very well here too, because as I recall, when Nietzsche first appeared as a philosopher, I just mentioned this recently, I think on a stream with someone, can't remember, but Nietzsche was very much seen as being almost an art critic when he first appeared. When he first began to get exposure.
Well, he wrote about Wagner. His first book was called The Birth of Tragedy.
Yes.
From the spirit of Wagner, and he try to establish Wagner as a sort of new. He wouldn't call it a religion, but it was all about something that would replace religion. Because religion was dead in his point of view, and art could do what religion could not do anymore. Art could bring salvation, beauty could bring salvation. So this was early Nietzsche. I mean, later he would change the tune a bit, but
yes, but what he did, I mean, well, it's been strongly argued actually by a German. I helped him translate his stuff into English. I think is he under the name Bernd Lasker? I know he's in Germany. But the LSR project, he did the thing about Mushak and Nietzsche and the first experience that Nietzsche had with Stirner, and the nihilism of Stirner, and you see quite clearly, and Lasker talks about it, that Stirner actually forced a reaction not only in Nietzsche, who said, wait a minute, if there's this nihilism, if there's nothing at the root of all these morals, then we must reestablish morals on some other basis. And in my reading of Nietzsche and my understanding of him, it seems to me that he was very much on a project to reestablish morals on a non-arbitrary basis, based on the idea that you would find a man, that a culture could be judged by the type of man it would produce, and that they would seek to produce this new man that would be, superior.
Yes, the man who would be more in harmony, so to speak, with what Nietzsche called the will to power, which he felt was being obscured by morals, and especially by Christian morals, and so.
And so, he had to write the Antichrist.
Sort of a life force which is beyond rationality, which had been lost, and the superior man would be fulfilled with that life affirming.
But he could be judged based on the fact that it was life affirming, so it was not arbitrary like all the moral systems previously. But what's interesting is Stirner also forced a reaction out of Marx, because Marx fell out with the young Hegelians and Hegel himself, and came up with the idea of making it materialistic, according to Lasker's reading, and I think he's right, based on his exposure to Stirner. So Stirner created a crisis in Nietzsche, which caused him to leave behind his first Wagner phase, right? But he also caused Marx to break with the young Hegelians. And Marx apparently wrote an absolutely enormous work that was going to be a refutation of Stirner. And then he got the idea for his dialectical materialism. He just put that away, never published it, and went straight into his whole communist riff. So Stirner, with a nihilistic opening, to draw the parallel here, however clumsily, you almost have the nihilistic opening of Stirner, like, your Throbbing Gristle and your chaos music and your Dog's Blood Rising and your smashing and your recognition that it's all chaos. And then it begins to form. And in the case of Nietzsche, he didn't have a way to have a transcendental vertical axis the way you would with religion. And so he sought to base it on something life affirming. And you turn over to what's his name, to Marx. You see that he just said, fuck the vertical dimension. We'll make it all flat. It's all materialist,
Yeah, but religion crept in through the back door, because communism or Marxism became a sort of messianic religion, promising that nirvana would ensue once we did the dictatorship of proletariat or whatever ideas you have. So lots of crypto religion. This is a thing that I think is important, that you want to deny the vertical basis, it always comes back through the back door. Almost all things, in my view, can be seen as religion in a broadest sense, that man needs something to transcend himself. And even those who believe in materialism or who believe in hedonism or so, subconsciously they're looking for it. And then sometimes they find the most stupid outlets. It could be that you become very nerdy about a certain type of music, and then it becomes a religion to collect the records of all these gods and to know about all the bands and to have all these sacred objects. And so I think you find religious behavior in all kinds of unexpected parts of human life. And sometimes they are more banal, sometimes they're more complex. And artists have a special position in that whole thing. I think every artist who claims to search for total expression of himself, regardless of what anyone else says, just this do your thing mentality, which was very strong in the Zine we discussed, is an heir to Nietzsche. And the artist is also the one that creates his own transcendence. It's especially interesting when you read about the way Death in June was sometimes the words fail me. The concept of Death in June for Douglas Pearce, the way he talked about it, especially in the early days, you could realize that he was creating his own religion with their own symbols out of his very own deep-seated obsessions and fantasies and whatever, something that came from his personality. And there were interviews where he would say, without Death in June, he would have no reason to live. This is the meaning of his life, this art that he creates. So is a cult that he, the artist, creates himself out of himself. But I think it would be a dead end if it would be all about himself. It would become stifling. At one point, you could not go any further. And this is why artists need to connect with other artists. Like, my heroes from that scene did. They worked on each other's albums. Somebody would bring to a record of his friend what he could not do, or they would completely open up to something beyond them, like David Tippett tried to do that. Like he would go and say, right, for me it's about Christ. He would be very, very enthusiastic, often talking about his religion and his beliefs. So it's something above him, something beyond him. Douglas, to my knowledge, he never went that way. He just stuck in his self-created world, which became a bit ridiculous when he grew older and more like a self-parody. But my thesis is that all artists that follow this line of extreme individualism are heirs of Nietzsche, and they will always find their limits in a certain way. So art, in a sense, in the modern sense, is a sort of self-made surrogate religion or transcendence. And this is why so many people want to become artists, even if they don't have any talent. It's because they want to find something that is within themselves that gives them a meaning of life, that gives them a transcendence, and also, of course, a charisma, to have influence on others. I mean, many people who are artists or who want to become artists, they also want to be admired, they want to be on stage, they want to be acknowledged, and so on. And today's art industry, I mean, not just today, this has been going on for centuries, not centuries, maybe a century by now, when the modern art appeared. It has created a system in which you can become a charismatic figure without having any talent whatsoever. You don't have to produce anything real anymore. You just have to be yourself. Modern artists like Marina Abramovic, they sell themselves like the piece of art. I'm the piece of art. I'm like a shaman. I'm like a transcendental figure who can connect you to otherworldly things. So there's this aura about the artist which is similar to the aura of the priest or the shaman or so on. I mean, you see where I'm going, to. The center is transcendence. What I'm talking here, the search for transcendence, and art is a way to go there. And if you are lucky enough, if you have this talent, you might find a way within yourself. Maybe this is your way to connect with God or whatever you call it. But of course, it also comes at the price of, I guess, great torments and of great feelings of self-doubt. And many artists, they do not create because they are so happy people. They create because they're very troubled people. And
Usually.
I think all those people that we mentioned here are obviously troubled people. They're all crazy. So David Dibbert and so, but it's okay to be crazy. Yeah, it's okay to be an outsider. It's okay to be crazy. It can guide you to a path, but you have to watch out. I mean, some I don't know what happened to Nietzsche. I mean, he famously got struck by a lightning, so to speak. Maybe the god he was running away from finally caught up with him. The hounds of gods, they chased him and they bit him, and maybe it was not Jesus but Dionysus. Something happened to him. Maybe
Yeah,
something similar what happened to Saint Paul, when Saint Paul was persecuting the Christians, all of a sudden
Saul struck blind. Yes.
And Nietzsche is a bit like Saul in my point of view. So we are dabbling here.
Except Saul didn't, or Paul didn't end up, in the arms of his sister. Yeah.
Yeah, but this is the thing. He's a Saul that failed, so to speak. He was too strong. It just blew him away. And this is always the danger when you go on a path like this. And
on all of these paths, and we mentioned these people who flew the plane into the side of the mountain. They just they disappeared. Well, that actually seems like a very good sort of summary for this this whole picture that we've been exploring. The only other thing I'd add to it, and then I'm we can wrap up now if it's all right with you, since we've come past 3 hours now. The one thing I wanted to add, and then there was one question I definitely want to get from the audience. The guy had asked several times for your opinion on it, but there's the one other thing I want to add is that there's very much the appearance of a group of people having come together and making this possible. You see it when you see the photograph of these people and some of these album covers, and you talk about how people were at Freya Aswyn's house. We were joking, people don't know, but Martin and I were talking beforehand, and we're like, maybe we could call it Freya Aswyn's basement, right? This whole clip. But there very much is this feeling that there was a group of people who came together, and it was their interconnectedness that sort of helped each one of them in their various experiments and projects. With Stephen Stapleton and Wakeford and Douglas P. and John Balance, and certainly with Sleazy, and and you have figures like Aswyn in the background, who seem to be almost like a glue that kind of brings these things together. I think that's just an important thing to think about here, because in other groups, like what was it, Tolkien and some of his other people, he called his little group the Inklings. You know,
I mean,
you'll find these different groups who come together and they all ping off of each other, and that helps drive it. That's just the other point I wanted to add.
Yeah, of course, the same is true for other genres of music or other music groups or groups of artists like the surrealists. There's always a synergy going on, an alchemy between these people. And if you discover this kind of music, this is the exciting scene. You know how many people are involved in it. There's a huge cosmos. It's like a cosmos of very different people who in a strange way are connected to each other, and there's so much to discover, and it's so exciting to delve into that. And this is what the Antifa literature on this whole thing missed. You know, they would only isolate the naughty groups, but they would never acknowledge the context in which they were perceived. Because if you were not just listening to Death in June, you were also, most people who were listening to Death in June were also listening to Coil or Current 93, which were about different things, and put this into a different relation, what Death in June was about. But these people who were so ignorant, they had no idea about this cosmos. They just saw the naughty, politically non-correct things, and they could attack, but they never got that there was a much bigger picture here. And this is what made it so attractive. There was something bigger happening here. And I don't know if there is a lesson here. The thing is, these things cannot be forced. I mean, I'm always fascinating when you encounter a new group of artists you're interested in, or it could be writers, could be painters, could be musicians, and then you realize who had known whom, who was friends with whom. You realize there's a whole cosmos there. You can dive into it, and these things just seemingly happen organically. Or it's a grace of God that these things kind of happen, that they are there. And when enough people are there who have a certain kind of spirit, they will find each other, they will connect, they will make something happen, and there it goes. I mention this because I often hear this discussion on the right that they say, who we need in order to be successful, we need more culture, you know, we need more music, or we need people who produce books or art and so. But the problem is, this is the wrong way around, because you do not start with politics and say we need art to have our politics, but you start with the art. Maybe it can result in politics or metapolitics, but if the art is not the most important thing to you, you will not succeed. You will just produce ideology. You will produce something boring and
just crap.
And very likely you will not find like-minded spirits with whom you connect. I think these like-minded spirits are always important. And when they are there, they will find each other. They will attract each other. Something will happen, but you cannot make it happen because you want it to happen. You say, oh, it would be so good if the let's say right-wing scene today had also a great group of artists on their side. Just don't work that way. You know, it works the other way around, and the way it works, I am afraid, is something God-given or God's given, however you might want to see it.
Yeah, fate, fortune, chance, grace, somewhere in there, right? Yeah.
You cannot make it. You can make it because you want it. It has to happen. It has to be given. Because in the end, it's a mystery. Why are some people born with a talent and others are not? And those that are born with a talent, they often have a strong sense of fate, that what they are doing is something they cannot choose otherwise. It's the fate they have to go and they have to fulfill. I have to be that person. I have to create this thing. I have to go down that path. That doesn't mean everything you do is destined, you know, but the path is sort of destined, and it's your responsibility how to walk that path and what to make out of it. You can also lose your way, and you can also bring yourself in danger. But the fascinating thing about people like Douglas or David Tibet, who had these strong visions and obsessions, is that it seems like they followed a fate. They could not do anything else than what they are doing now. And I must say, even myself, for a lower level, I'm not an artist, and I think artists are far better than intellectuals or whatever you want to call me. But sometimes I wonder the position I'm having. I'm also with the intellectual outsiders. I'm on the wrong political side. I'm with the political incorrect. I'm with those that don't have no power in the world at this point, and those who always say things nobody wants to hear. And sometimes I ask myself, why the hell am I doing this? And then I think, because I cannot help myself. It's just what I believe to be true. It's just my destiny, so to speak. And this is what sort of unites me when I hear somebody like Peter Christopher say, it's important to be an outsider. It's important to do what you feel is true, even though he was about completely different things than I am. Wait, I cannot hear you. Sorry, you have.
Oh, sorry, I have my mute on.
Yourself.
I'm all. I'm obviously an intellectual who can't operate a fucking computer. We have a few questions. One is from Bjarki, who is saying that Rose McDowell was more important than Aswin. That may well be the case. I don't know these people, and I don't even pretend to. So a lot of this is guesswork. We've already said that earlier.
I think it's a worthwhile opinion, but I would not fight about it. It's possibly true.
And then the other one, he says something like "elephant in the room." Why do you never mention Michael? I don't even know who he's talking about there.
Michael Cashmore or Michael Moynihan? I don't know which Michael.
I don't know. Oh,
I mentioned Michael Moynihan.
He just said Moynihan, not Cashmore.
Moynihan. So. Well, yeah, he was not so directly related to that kind of. He came later. He came only. He was a friend of Boyd Rice. He was from the US. He was on the Music Martini and Misanthropy album, but his contribution was very small. So he was the later generation, so to speak. I mean, one could speak. I like him. I really love the Gospel of Inhumanity. The first album was just awesome, and he's a very interesting figure. But this would be a whole new story to discuss him.
Well, then I have another one that is just sort of random out there, and I think this comes from Vinculum, and he says he wanted to hear your opinion, if you know the band, on some band called Brain Bombs out of Scandinavia, maybe Sweden, I want to say.
Never heard of them. I'm sorry.
Brain Bombs. Okay. Yes.
Never heard of them.
Well, then. First off, thank you very, very much for joining me. This has been a great discussion, and if in future there is ever any topic you ever want to discuss again, you are very, very welcome whenever you like on my channel. I wanted to just ask you if you have any sort of closing thoughts about this in order to wrap up, and if you have, and also if there's anything you want to shill or promote. I know that my audience isn't really German speaking, so maybe that won't help. But if there is anything you want to share or point to or shill, please do. But first off, any closing thoughts?
I have nothing to share, shill, or else to say. I just would, anyone who has listened to this show now and has become interested in the bands we are talking about, I wish them good luck with their discoveries, and I must say I'm really jealous that you can make these discoveries anew and again, because you just can make those once in your life. Maybe it will not fascinate you as much as it did me, but maybe I pointed you to some interesting adventure here. So good luck for that, if I could arouse your interest.
Yeah, I totally. It hit me like a train when I was a kid. When I first heard this music, I was like, "Holy shit!" Yeah. And then you find your way through it. You find each person has their own sort of different band and things that they like the most. So check it out. And again, there's that feeling that all these people were interrelated in weird ways. And again, there's the whole occult side of it, which is separate. It appears in the music, but really were organized behind the scenes in many respects with their own interests. Again, like the rune lore stuff, like an Ian Reed or a Freya Aswin, or the chaos magic stuff with like a Charles Brewster or a Peter Carroll or a John Balance, or even going back, like we said, to the Sleazy and some of the other Coil guys being interested in the Brian Geisen stuff and the William S. Burroughs. So there's a lot of background there too as well.
It's a great, I call it the cosmos, a great cosmos to explore, and it will make you look different at many things in a good way. That's what I think.
Yeah. Right on. Well, I have a little question here from Bjarki saying, "Can I come on and talk about it sometime?" It's something I'd be willing to consider. Usually, I only have guests on that I can see somewhere before I have them on. No offense to you, but there are a lot of strangers out there in the world, and I don't know who they are. So, yeah. But you can email me, Bjarki. Just and I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, but email me at semiagog at protonmail.com and pitch the idea to me. And certainly I'd consider it. The other thing is, again, Martin and I both have this book. Everyone should go out and buy this book on the Metaphysical Poets. I absolutely love it. It is just the bomb. There's so much great stuff in it. Cannot recommend it highly enough. It's just a side thing. It is the bomb.
The bomb, yeah.
Wunderbar.
Yeah. Wunderbar. And now that I'm briefly online, I want to show this very rare book. Is really a wonderful fan-written book on Death in June. It's basically a comment on the discography of Death in June up to that point, 1949 or so. And I really love it, and it's hard to get. And my copy has a autograph of Douglas P. And the other book, which is you can get it, but it's very expensive. This is this book, England's Hidden Reverse by Dave Keenan. It's also a great, wonderful book, which has a lot of stuff to infect you and get you interested in those people. So
excellent. Yes, then there's further reading, and I recommend everybody check out Crash Worship as well, which is a side thing, but definitely worth having a look at. Okay, then. Well, then I say thank you very much to Martin. I say thank you very much to all the people watching who stuck with us for this long, winding discussion. I really enjoyed it. I hope you all did too, and I hope you'll join us again soon. So with that, I am Semiagog, and I am out.